think I will first just to indicate to the audience that our first speakers is Jefferson Scavio. He's a doctoral candidate in social anthropology from the Museu Nacional in Brazil. And he is going to present his paper.
Hello, my name is Jefferson Scavio. I am a PhD candidate in social anthropology in National Museum, Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. And the work I'm going to present today is called If I Do Nothing, I Am More Dead Than Him, Dora's Plea. My son was shot dead. If I do nothing, I am more dead than him, Dora told me. Santiago, her son, is one of the victims of the episode that would be known as Castle Slaughter. On April 2003, 4 residents of Castle Hill, favela in Rio de Janeiro, were killed in a trap set by a group of 16 military police officers. Santiago's shouting would give Dora's life a new direction. To not be more dead than him became synonymous with fighting for justice. I came to know Dora as one of the mothers of people killed by police officers with whom I have been working over the past years. Our dad have a voice, our children had mothers. The motto is say, or better, shout, in a manner of a chorus, a collective liturgy made out of a dialogue between the mother who speaks and the ones who listen. Or that the speaker shouts, have a voice, respond the listeners. Or children, the speaker scream, have mothers, respond the listeners. Bio, Thanato, and necropolitics. A whole set of terms was developed to account for the intimate relationship between life and death as surfaces, materials of power, enabling us to reflect on how inequality enacts and it's enacted, not only differentiating, but hierarchizing lives and deaths. Such a discussion tells us little about how concretely these policies take place, how they actually work and with what effects. Not surprisingly, even less is told about how and if those who are made targets by state races live under such a deadly social placement, how they may resist to it. To reflect on this issue, I will present the story of Dora and her son Santiago, as she described it to me. It had been 10 minutes since her son had left home on that April afternoon, when Dora heard the sound of the shots. She tells me that the shots were very closely in the same place from the same weapons. Coming back home from work, Santiago had played a video game with his younger brother for a while, and as Dora told me, before he left home, he put some money into his pocket and said he was going to meet his childhood friend, Charles, who was getting a haircut and would then go to buy chocolate Easter eggs for both his daughter and his niece. Santiago and Charles were in front of the barber shop when they heard a shot and ran to the alley in an attempt to protect themselves. Francisco, a friend who was passing by, also ran with them. There in the alley, however, they would meet a group of policemen waiting. The police officer shot, and Santiago, Charles, and Francisco fell. Santiago was still alive and said he was not a criminal, asking to show his documents. No, you are going to die because you are a criminal, said one of the officers. As the cadaver report would show, the shots that killed Santiago were fired at a close range. The barber shop was on the same street as the family house. When Dora's husband opened the front door, several police cars were driving up. Unable to access the alley, as the vehicles were blocking the passage, he went around to the other side where he found residents pouring water to rinse the blood from the ground. Returning home, Dora's husband found her leaving. She then tells me, they were going down with my son's body to put it in the police car. They had already given me medicine. I say, no, my son. And then the police started firing their apples, pointing up and say, If you want to see him, go to the hospital. Dora was unable to do the body recognition. Santiago's partner and Dora's sisters did it. My son was already there, lifeless, without clothes. I say, but how? The police murdered Santiago on a Wednesday. The burial took place in the following day when it was the God Friday. In the following day, when it was the God Friday, I say, no, I want to see this newspaper. Shot out kills four in a favela hill. Say the headlines of the report. Simply replicating the report of the commandant at the head of that mission, the news affirmed that the dead were part of a drug dealer's gang. They went down the hill to rob the streets of the neighborhood. As alleged evidence, it was presented weed, cocaine, pistols, revolvers, and a homemade bomb. Not as an homicidal, but as a crime of resistance to police, was the official rubric of the report made by them. That is, a legal kill committed by police officers in defense against the attack of the victims. I spent a week in despair, Dora recalls. Castro residents, however, didn't stay silent. People were talking about it, the community got mobilized. It was said that something must be done. Four youths were murdered. None were criminals. And even if they were, there was no justification, she tells me. Besides, they were not alone. Mothers and relatives of victims from other favelas came to help. They constructed a social movement and named it Can I Present Myself? A name showing the speech of the victims. As Santiago, also the fourth victim the police made that day, tried to show his documents to prove he was a worker, but had his arm broken by the officer before being executed. The slaughter of Castell would gain national and international projection. And in December of that year, the prosecutor officer would ask for the preventive arrest of 5 of the policemen involved in that operation. We got some tranquility, Dora says. Over the years, however, one after other, the police officer were acquainted in court. The police plot was done by a trickery set. One doing the crime scene, removing the bodies under the pretext of aid, planting false evidence, all of it made official through the so-called resistance to police record. In face of the struggle of Dora, however, the version that the victims were criminal weakened. The police officers claimed that they had not fired, or else that it was an intense shot in the dark and that they had little visibility. Their lawyers in turn worked to postpone the trials infinitely, making the criminal falsifying evidence to prevaricate, and finally, getting a jury favorable to their absolution. They are meant to judge and kill, but they are not meant to assume what they did, Dora says. Dora obtained the trial and imprisonment of 5 of those responsible for the death of her son, in addition to having won the civil reparation process for her family. She investigated, managed to get witnesses to testify, and ensured that the murder weapons were tested. She became an assistant prosecutor in the trials, all despite insistent threats she would receive from the police. The police officers ended up being released, but it is worth saying that what Dora got from legal justice is something extremely rare, given that the overwhelmingly majorities of deaths caused by police officers are not even investigated. Legal complaints are not made, and the occurrence being simply filed due to the supposed absence of illegality. If the evidence Dora produced was not enough for the official justice, she no longer has any illusions about it. It's not for us. We have no right to that justice. In one of the banners of the Can I Present Myself movement, above of the pictures of the victims, one reads, "Without justice, there is no peace. They did not let us speak, but many will speak for us." In 2007, the then governor of Rio de Janeiro, defended the legalization of abortion as a way to contain violence. He said, and I quote, "You take the number of children per mother in Lagoa Rio de Freitas, Tijuca, Meyer, and Copacabana, ascendant neighborhoods in Rio de Janeiro, it's a Swedish standard. Now take Rocinha, favela, it's a standard Zambia, Gabon. This is a marginal producing factory the state cannot handle." In his classical formulation of how ideology concretely interpellates subjects, Althusser used the image of a policeman calling an individual on the street. "Hey, you there!" According to the author, by the mere physical movement of turns to attend the police, the individual becomes subject. If I am allowed to take this allegory in a concrete way, looking at it from the story of Dora and Santiago, I can say that both were interpolated as subjects by his murder, the interpolation here being metonym to destruction. But even still, did she or even he recognize themselves in this deadly call? In the way Dora presents the story of her son's murder, she resists the accusatory framing of her son's shooting. Furthermore, what Dora tells us how she and her body, in persistent struggle, re-narrates the story. Neither he was a criminal nor her womb a marginal factor. Coming from work, playing with his younger brother, going to meet his childhood friends, excited about the trip that he had even packed for it already. But even still, Santiago couldn't forget the girl's chocolate. So he had to get ahead in the shops. From the way Dalvan remembers the noise of the shots, coming from the same place, from the same gun, to the affective memories of Santiago's last moments, Dora not simply deconstructs the version of the crossfire, justifying Santiago's innocence, but she does so by presenting the intertwined daily life of Santiago and his family. He, as a person who was made through those ties of care. It took a day for Dora to be brave enough to read the newspaper report, and reading it carried a week of despair. But from there, the story of Dalton Santiago opens up for the fight. At the end of the interview, Dora tells me how, as a child, if Santiago's temperature got too high, he would have a seizure. I fought so hard for my son to stay alive. We even have a poster that says, "While the rich men struggle to get richer, we fight to stay alive." Or again, "My son was shot dead. If I do nothing, I am more dead than him."
Hello. The title of this presentation is De-Indianization as a Threat to Indigenous Lands in Bolsonaro's Brazil. Indigenous people carry the name of their people as their last name. Daniel Munduruku, a writer, states that carrying the Munduruku name is a way of asserting that he is part of a people that has a beautiful story to tell. In a general sense, the indigenous population in Brazil is composed of 305 indigenous peoples, speaking 274 different languages. Despite this diversity, the whole indigenous population of Brazil has been historically unified under the name Indian, as part of a process called Indianization. The origin of the name Indian is attributed by most to the fact that when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they thought they had arrived in India, or the Indies as they refer to all South and East Asia. Thus, this category of Indian constituted a new modern colonial identity invention that homogenized the heterogeneous identities that existed in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. As important as acknowledging these people's difference is recognizing that most of indigenous people in Brazil are exposed to the same situations of vulnerability. By the unification of all the indigenous peoples under the name Indian, they were also subjected to similar conditions of oppression. To anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, the indigenous peoples were Indianized to better be de-Indianized. The de-Indianization of the Indian, as well as the de-Africanization of the black people, is a process of deculturation in which ideal conditions are achieved for an ethnic transfiguration, where these people, stripped of their identity, find themselves condemned to invent a new ethnicity encompassing all of them. There is a constant attempt to de-Indianize the indigenous people by turning them into poor Brazilians, landless, without their own subsistence means, forced to sell their arms, their bodies, to enrich the would-be new landowners. While being an indigenous person is being part of a community linked to a particular place and a particular people, being a Brazilian citizen is being part of a population that is controlled by the state. This shift promotes a desensitization of the individual in relation to the exploitation of his or her habitat, which is essential to a sort of capitalism that is oriented towards the exhaustion of nature resources. Despite their variety and specificities, indigenous peoples in general have a strong bond to the land. Besides depending on the land for their subsistence, their mythical discourse and exegesis are inseparable from their empirical reality. The relations between an indigenous society and the components of its environment are thought and lived as social relations, that is, relationships between people as a communication between subjects that interconstitute themselves in the act and through the act of exchange. Melobo Ikipeng, the high chief of the Ikipeng people, states, "We indigenous people originated from tree trunks. That's why we always say to white people, do not deforest, because the forests are our relatives, the forests are all of us." To indigenous leader and environmentalist Ailton Krenak, when we depersonalize the river, the mountain, we liberate these places so that they become waste from industrial and extractivity activities. The way of life of the indigenous people has been essential to nature preservation and a centuries-old way of resisting exhaustion of nature through extractivist practices. According to a recent report, demarcated indigenous territories have absorbed emissions of 431 million tons of carbon dioxide between 2006 and 2020. To the perpetuation of this environmentally friendly way of life, indigenous people must have their right to land secured. In Brazil, one of the most successful and threatened attempts to secure this to land is the Indigenous Lands Policy. The Indigenous Lands Policy has been implemented in Brazil by the 1988 Federal Constitution and asserts that the right of indigenous peoples to the land they traditionally occupied are prior to the formation of the state itself. Since then, despite the advances, indigenous peoples have faced innumerable threats to their recently acquired right to the land. Among these, we find the approval of the proposed Constitutional Amendment 215 in 2015 that benefited land grabbers by stating that in order to be entitled to their lands, indigenous peoples should have been occupying them by 1988, not taking into account their expulsion from these traditional territories before that date. Eviction and land-grabbing threats have been intensified with the election of President Jair Bolsonaro in 2019. Bolsonaro's actions and statements are systematically focused on dismantling the indigenous right to their traditional territories. A clear move by President Bolsonaro has been transferring the responsibility of indigenous land demarcation affairs from the National Indian Foundation to the Ministry of Agriculture. This exposes his alignment with the so-called Bancada Ruralista, a group comprising members of parliament such as the Minister of Agriculture herself, Teresa Cristina, which acts according to the interests of large rural landowners. The effort made by the Bancada Ruralista to elect Bolsonaro was partially attributed to his positioning about changes to the indigenous lands policy. The alignment of Jair Bolsonaro's office with such approach to the use of natural resources and the environment is a constant threat to the right to land constitutionally assured to indigenous peoples, as well as to their lives. As a result of Bolsonaro's endorsement of indigenous lands invasions, the murders of indigenous leaders has risen, reaching in 2019 its highest number in 11 years. There were 7 murders in 2019 against 2 in 2018. One of the most recent cases affected indigenous leader Ari Uruewawao, who was beaten to death on April 18 this year, after several death threats over the last months. Ari was part of a group responsible for registering and reporting illegal logging in the indigenous land of the Uruewawao in the Rondônia state. The Indigenous Association Jupau has gathered reports from indigenous leaders who said they have been suffering threats by land invaders and also pointed out the ineffectiveness of governmental institutions responsible for these issues, such as IBAMA and FUNAI. Death threats are not the only danger suffered by indigenous lands inhabitants, as legal and political threats are also common to these areas. The indigenous land Raposa Serra do Sol is one of the largest in the country. Located in the Roraima state in the northeast of Brazil, it has a perimeter of 1,000 square kilometers and a population of more than 25,000 people. For being located in an area so large and rich in natural resources, Raposa Serra do Sol is a constant target for those who seek indigenous rights restrictions. During his opening speech at the United Nations in 2019, President Bolsonaro stated that the Indian does not want to be a poor landowner over rich lands. This is the case of the Yanomami and Raposa Serra do Sol reserves. By saying this, he implies that indigenous peoples in these lands would like to rent it to extractivist activities, such as mining and logging. In the same speech, Bolsonaro attacks indigenous leaders despite providing no evidence or taking any legal action by saying that some of these leaders, such as Chief Raoni, are used by foreign governments in their information war to move their interests forward in the Amazon. The president's aggressive language against the indigenous peoples has sparked resistance from them. In January 2020, there was a historical meeting of 47 peoples taking place at Piaraçu village in Mato Grosso state. More than 600 indigenous leaders were gathered during a week to discuss and elaborate a document, the Manifesto do Piaraçu. This text states their common interests and assertions against the threat of Bolsonaro's comments and actions. Only we can talk about ourselves and for ourselves. We do not admit our chiefs being disrespected, just as Bolsonaro did in 2019 in his speech during the UN meeting against Chief Raoni. We affirm that Chief Raoni is our leadership. He does represent us. Trying to speak for indigenous people without actually listening to them, Jair Bolsonaro nurtures the idea that the Indians should be contributing to the success of exhaust nature, which is opposite to their beliefs. Actions like the Manifesto do Piaraçu allow these culturally diverse peoples to express their own demands in all their multiplicity of voices, being essential to the protection of indigenous lands. Through these acts of resistance, they might be able to show the so-called Brazilian people that they are, as they continue to be, a multiplicity both patent and latent of peoples in a state of continuous variation that contains an immense unconscious reserve of difference capable of generating many other futures than this one that beckons us. In recognizing themselves as being historically unified by the name Indian, the indigenous peoples in Brazil have managed to retaliate against the state, accepting this generality and demanding from it the rights that such generality confers on them, by the letter and the spirit of the 1988 Federal Constitution. By understanding that they have historically been through similar situations and mechanisms of oppression, these different peoples have been able to organize themselves around the same primary goal, that is claiming for the rights to their traditional territories. In this context, the de-Indianization of indigenous people is also an attempt of disrupting their political organization. To conclude, it is important to note that dispute over land distribution policies is not a discussion exclusive to Jair Bolsonaro's government. This is not a scenario that is likely to change significantly right after the end of his office. Despite the effectiveness of the organized indigenous movement in Brazil, there is still a long way until the right to their traditional territories is fully secured. Bolsonaro represents a long-living capitalist mechanism of exhaustion of nature resources that can also be reproduced by the following administrations. There is definitely a need of close attention to Bolsonaro's office policies towards indigenous lands, but it's also essential understanding that only constant pressure from indigenous and non-indigenous people is able to promote effective changes throughout history. The indigenous lands policy is a solid attempt to repair historical inequality. More than that, it is approaching indigenous thought as an alternative to the times of intense nature devastation and global warming. The acknowledgement of the indigenous thought is a project for the future, not a memory of the past, making the prosperity of such policy a matter of global concern. Thank you.
Well, Jefferson, thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. And yeah, I really appreciated your fresh insights on racial violence, activism, and mourning in Brazil. And I would like to start this round of questions for you, and then open it to the general for the attendees. So I was very interested in your conceptualization of police brutality, and also the question of biopolitics in the way in which police is taking the lives of a Black young man such as Santiago in Rio de Janeiro, and you are conceptualizing this event through the use of Luis Althusser, the notion of interpellation. But while I was watching the video, this description of what Dora navigates through the feeling of Santiago, it very much reminded me. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, very much reminded me what Ruth Wilson Gilmore is describing in the Gulag, when she talks about the exploitation of vulnerability to premature death, which is pretty much the quote that you use at the end by telling how Dora struggled to keep his son alive, and how actually really contextualize the ways in which a Black subject and deaths are operate or are affected by these constructions of oppression and space in Rio de Janeiro. So can you tell us a bit more why you're using the idea of interpellation to explain the case of Santiago?
Hal, first, I would like to thank you guys for organizing such a nice place of discussion and give me the opportunity of bringing this history of Dora and Santiago. I would say like that I wasn't aware of the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, but it's like a citing new reference that I'm definitely using. And as much as I understood,
we can't hear you. We can't hear you. Jefferson.
Story. I brought it like more in effort to dislocate it than in effort like to getting his idea, and mainly because of the theoretical scene that he puts that I think that's really interesting of the policyman calling someone. Because actually, when I look to this history, what is impressive to me is that they try to like Dora, Santiago, the other victims, all of them, they try, let's say, to respond to this question, but they couldn't, no? They try to show the documents, and after it, all the fight of Dora and the movement Cannot Present Myself is a movement to respond, let's say, to this like calling of, but like,
the questions, they are not like, there was no waiting for like the response. Like as my interlocutors in the favelas, they say, the police in favela shots first and asks after. So I am engaging with like this discussion of biopolitics, necropolitics, and I think it's really a fruitful discussion, especially in Rio de Janeiro and Brazil, because it's as a kind of the terror or the place of that in the government is not something that has been discussed that much here. It's more like a discussion over like on-site hates and things like that. But by the other side, what I think is just like that these discussions, they bring us a good way to see how life and that are in scripts in like in the power workings, but it says little how concretely these policies work and how people who are targeted by these policies react or living under such a deadly social placement. So my point in bringing the history of data, and I couldn't explain that's a kind of like, these are a lot of crosses with other stories of moms and sons killed by police, is one, like to show these mechanisms like in a really like ethnographical way. And what are these mechanisms in that case? Like, first, like there is this discourse over favela as a criminal place, but this is not just abstracted. What you have there, like the managing of the crime sign, you have like the plantation of proof, you have like the so-called resistance to police report. That means that the state can kill some people without naming, without like recognize that they are racist. They are not being racist. They are just following that device. That device allowed them to do it without to name it. You know, and by the other side, I think like one dangerous point of this discussion of necropolitics and biopolitics that it annulates the place of the resistance. And then my question is like, when I bring about Sarah, do they like respond in the way I don't think so. Like by the way she's fighting over like right now 70 years of fighting for justice, and by the way she's fighting it like and put this fight in the relation with her son. So like, I wouldn't say that like he was killed, but like not as someone for her. So I would say that I am still trying to like create a language that would allow me to not like take out the call of biopolitics and ecopolitics, but like make account for this resistance of the victims.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you again, Jefferson. I'm gonna move. I hope everyone can hear me. And I'm gonna move now to another question to our speaker, Enrique Gomez, from the University of Hong Kong, in his paper, The Indigenization as a Threat to Indigenous Reserves in Bolsonaro's Brazil. And Enrique, what is
hello.
Hello. Lovely to see you, Enrique, and thank you so much for your presentation as well as your presentation. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, I really also appreciate the fresh insights that you are giving us through the challenges that Indigenous people are facing currently under this hostile climate under the far-right government of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. And I was very interested, I would like to start asking you, Enrique, I was very interested in these processes of the Indianization that you are discussing in your paper that seems to be like are processes very much dictated by the state, workings of power by the state. And how is this process of the Indianization affecting the racial identity of Indigenous communities inside these communities? I mean, in other words, are there people who might have identified themselves as Indigenous and now under this hostile climate, under Bolsonaro's far-right, disengaging from their Indigenous identity, or is happening something vice versa? Can you expand a bit more on that, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, Nadia, I think it's difficult to make an accurate analysis of this racial identification of Indigenous peoples in Brazil during the Bolsonaro government, mainly due to the lack of more recent official demographic data to understand this better. However, I believe we can understand some of the impacts of this government on this issue by discussing racial identification of indigenous people in Brazil more generally. Uh, Racial identification has always been an issue for Brazilian indigenous people. There is a long historical process of denial of indigenous identity in Brazil, especially due to the violent genocidal and ethnocidal process that these populations have been going through since colonial times until today in Brazil. Despite having their rights guaranteed through the 1988 Constitution, indigenous people suffer from the neglection of these rights. By declaring yourself as indigenous in Brazil is a way of putting pressure on public authorities and having access to at least part of these rights. I believe it's important to recognize that these peoples have experienced similar situations of oppression and are entitled to historical reparation. And identification is obviously a tool to get this done. Indigenous movement in Brazil works hard for the pride of being an indigenous person, to escape this feeling and this fear of oppression, to claim their rights. There has been a growth and a greater organization of the indigenous movement in Brazil since the 70s, especially to respond these attempts of de-Indianization during the military dictatorship that was during this period. The indigenous rights in Brazil were mainly introduced with the 1988 Constitution and was the achievement of struggles from this indigenous movement. So, assuming the identity of Indians, as I said in my paper, while still celebrating the plurality of the indigenous peoples, is a way of claiming their constitutional rights in a way. So, for these reasons, through the organization and development of the indigenous movement, it is possible to observe an increase in the self-declaration of indigenous people in Brazil, actually. Despite all these oppressions, these numbers are increasing. I got some numbers here in my notes. Yeah, according to the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, the IBGE in Brazil, the self-declared indigenous population grew 178% in 30 years. So we had 290,000 people, indigenous people, declared in 1991. And in 2010, we had 817,000 people. So it's like almost 200% growth in this period. And we were supposed to have a new demographic census this year in Brazil, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was postponed to the next year. So I believe in 2021, we'll have access to more precise data at the moment. But something I think that it's important to understand that despite this growth of the indigenous population at a national level, as we see in this demographic census, it does not necessarily mean that at a local level, there is no fear of declaring yourself as an indigenous person. This fear is even more present in indigenous communities close to urban agglomerations. For example, I can cite here the Guarani Kaiowá indigenous people. They inhabit a region in the south of the state of Mato Grosso do Sul that's practically within the city of Dourados, that it's a city with more than 200,000 inhabitants. Their conflicts with landowners are constant, and in recent years, the frequent death of Guarani Kaiowá leaders by hired gunmen has gained international repercussions too. So there, if you recognize yourself as Guarani Kaiowá, you automatically become a potential target for armed militias of large rural landowners. So I believe that even when you have the courage to self-declare yourself as indigenous, there is a slight, how could I say, a guilt for being an Indian of these people sometimes. Indigenous organizations such as APIB, for example, that's the Coalition of the Indigenous People of Brazil, the main one, they frequently highlight the cultural wealth of these people as a way to rescue their pride of being indigenous, to fight this guilt for being an Indian. This guilt, for example, is the result of the constant racial prejudice suffered by many populations, and it stimulates the depression in many of them. For you to have an idea, the suicide mortality rate among indigenous people in Brazil is 3 times the national average. So while Brazil records around five deaths for 100,000 inhabitants, the rate in indigenous people is 15 deaths, so 3 times. And so indigenous teenagers especially suffer a lot of bullying when in contact with non-indigenous people too. I believe that President Bolsonaro, by attacking indigenous peoples with racist statements in public, he encourages a series of racist actions against these people which can certainly worsen the situation. And I'm waiting for the next demographic census to see the impact on official data too. I think that's it.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much. Now I will open the floor for some questions that the attendees are sending. One of the questions is for Jefferson. It's coming from Maria Bejarano. She says, thank you, Jefferson, for your video. It shows a very accurate description of the archetypical situation in the Americas. Yesterday case in Minneapolis, it was just one more, for instance. How do you see the role of the academic in front of these barbaric acts? And which is the role of the anthropologist academic from your own places of work? This is for you, Jefferson. And I will keep reading if you like. So there is another one for you, Enrique. So you can actually, come back to it. Let me just read this for Enrique, and then I'll come back to you, Jefferson. So this one is for Enrique. So similar issues are faced by indigenous peoples in Mexico. How do you see geopolitics in Brazil and the connection with global neoliberalism in the last 4 or 5 decades? That's for Enrique. Yes, and then we will come back with a couple more for you two guys. Would you like to respond, or would you like me to keep reading questions? How do you prefer this? Hello?
I could either respond now or wait for more questions. I don't know how.
Okay, perfect. Let's do that. Let's yeah.
Works.
Okay. Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can.
No, I will respond though. This one
from Maria Bejarano.
I think first between. Sorry. Should I go? Yeah. Well, I think that first, thank you for the question, and the comparison, the similarity between Brazil and US. I think there is a lot of similarities in terms of police brutality, and also in terms of how the resistance takes place, because there is crossings and sharings of strategies, of aesthetics of fight and stuff. But I think at the same time that I see similarities between racial violence and the two ways it works. I think the case of Rio de Janeiro is a case of an excessive case. The police of Rio de Janeiro kills too much people. It's not there is no comparison even inside of Brazil. If you think while São Paulo police, for example, is putting people in jail, the police of Rio de Janeiro is killing people. Before Bolsonaro and all this really terrible wave we are living right now, we are already living in a moment where 5 young Black guys would be killed by day in police in favela. So that's really scary, and it's something that not just my work, but our works are trying to make account for what kind of, even in terms of necropolitics, sometimes they don't look to account for that. They are not enough for that. So that's the first point. And what is the place of the anthropologist and the academic is in this? That was a big question for me over my field work and over the relation I have with these people. I think the place of the anthropologist in this place is the place of support, of listening support. Support, how I understood the support in this case, I was doing with them what they need me to do, what I could do. When it comes to write letters to a judge or to the public plus secretary, we are there with them, like trying to put the words in a way that like was like more, let's say, official and things like that, trying to being there like when they need things of as health issues that comes with like the losing of the sun. And but like there is a point that is the support itself that I don't think that we should forget that, because actually I think especially in favelas in Brazil there is kind of like anthropologists and researchers, they go there and they think that they have this right to research in itself, and I don't think so. Like, and is that this kind of movements are saying right now, like, it's not just because you are like an academic you can hear and talk about us. Like, it's not that they're closing the door. I don't think it's like that. They're just like claiming another kind of relation. So one point is the support you can do for what people are doing, the way they are doing. But the other, I think here is another point and how you do anthropology from that. And I think like one of the things I'm trying to do here is being really careful in the way they put the question, in the way they narrate the story, because this is important for them. Like the question they are rising against is the dead and the narrative that comes together with the dead, that they are criminals and things like that. So like bringing these narratives in the way they take place in the war, in the way they embody, I think is what I can do in this case as anthropology. Like as this anthropology, I like a lot, Calavina does says, offer or test as a possible embodiment of the suffering of the other. I don't think that closed the question, but is the way I had seen it and trying to open like avenues to work together with them.
Excellent. Now, Enrique?
Yeah, who did that question? Who asked that?
This question was coming from Manuel May Castillo. So do you want me to read the question for you?
No, I got this here. Okay. Right. So, hi, Manuel, thank you for your question. And unfortunately, I see that many countries have this issue in common with Brazil, not only Mexico, but other countries like Chile, for example. So I think there is this global tendency of indigenous people being oppressed by these extremely new liberal capitalist trends and practices. I believe the main point of conflict between indigenous people and this kind of new liberal extractivist and nature exhaustion practice is the territory dispute. While indigenous people see their traditional territories as something sacred, these large rural landowners, as is the case of Brazil, seek to profit from it until the complete depletion of nature resources. So, yeah, I think it's hard to make an analysis of 40 or 50 years of neoliberalism in Brazil right now, especially because we don't have much time. But in Brazil, we had a military dictatorship in between from 1964 until the 80s. So this was a special occasion too that demands a bit of attention. But I'd be really glad if we could keep in touch to discuss these similarities between Mexico and Brazil. And I believe we will have much in common to talk about this.
Yes, thank you. Well, we are running out of time, but I'm going to ask a couple of more questions from the public. One of them is for Enrique. This is coming from the Professor Angela Torresan. The question is, would you please talk about this idea of the culturalization of the Indianized indigenous groups and the process of inverting a new ethnicity? The idea of the culturation is precisely the argument that right politics use to claim indigenous people are no longer indigenous. This concept of deculturation seems to me a little deterministic. How do you engage with it, especially given the many political moments of indigenous people from the Northeast who will be considered deculturated according to this de-Indianized concept? And another one quick for Jefferson is this one is coming from Anna. another of our panelists, she said, Jefferson, you talk about listening. So I'm wondering, who does actually listen to the mothers and their protesters? Which is the response of the public, media, etc.? You.
Okay. So can I start?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Yeah. So Angela, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that this argument of deculturation is something that's pretty old, but at the same time is unfortunately pretty recent in Brazil. I think that a concept that's good to try to understand this in Brazil is the idea of democracia racial, that probably you've heard about it. That's racial democracy that has always been very, very strong in Brazil. It's basically, it says that, how could I simplify this? That this, in Brazil, we had a specific miscegenization process in where where racial discrimination is actually not a real problem when you think about economic and political unbalance, for example. So here in Brazil, for example, President Bolsonaro, as well as his allies, defends the idea that the indigenous people should be integrated into society. That's something that deals with this idea of deculturation. However, this integration that he says is the same integration proposed by the military dictatorship, for example. It's mainly the Indianization, is to eliminate all differences and pluralities of indigenous people. It's the transformation of the indigenous people, indigenous person, sorry, into a poor and landless Brazilian citizen, as I stated in the paper. So in Brazil, a great exponent of the social democracy was Gilberto Freire, and he published Casa Grande Senzala, that's a book called Masters and Slaves in English. It was published in 1933. So just to be brief here, Freire argues that the Brazilian people would be kind of a meta race, a product of miscegenization between indigenous, black, and white people that was balanced in the private sphere. He uses a concept of a balance of antagonisms to analyze these relations between master and slave, white and black, man and woman, the Casa Grande, that was the master's house, and Senzala, that was the slave's quarter. So to Gilberto Freire, there was a certain tolerance developed through these relationships between races. I think it's important to emphasize that at the time, 1933, the discussion of the concept of race in Brazil was guided by biology mainly. So considering the historical context in which this work was published, there was an epistemological rupture that shifted the discussion of race from biology to social sciences in Brazil. He proposes that race is not a biological category, but a cultural one. And this shift, despite of all the problems with racial democracy, this shift was important. But if you compare to Darcy Ribeiro, for example, that was an important Brazilian anthropologist that was most active between the 60s and the 90s, this tolerance was just another form of oppression. Darcy Ribeiro called this tolerance among the races in Brazil like an oppressive tolerance. So the master tolerates the slave as long as he can exploit and oppress him permanently. So there's not necessarily respect. From the moment that the enslaved black person is freed, for example, and starts to dispute jobs with the white, there is no more tolerance. Racism becomes more evident in its most cruel ways. From the moment the indigenous person, for example, has access to university in Brazil, he's classified as ignorant, as primitive, as unable to grasp the knowledge as white people do. So these arguments of deculturation comes in this way, as you said, as an extreme right and almost fascist way of relating to these people as primitive. So in short, for Darcy Ribeiro, as I was talking, it has to do with the type of colonization that took place in Brazil. He calls this colonization the mercantile salvationist empire. It was like a commercial mercantile enterprise, but it also had a salvationist ideological component that was given by the strong presence of the Catholic Church, for example. So the idea was not only to exploit economically enslaved indigenous and Black people, but also to save them for being non-Christians and soulless, for example. So this salvationism does not imply segregationism, but the constitution of this assimilationist racism. The concept of racial democracy in this way does not actually see the dimension of racism, which is key to understand structural racism in Brazilian society. And just to conclude, I said all this because Bolsonaro brings out the worst facet of racial democracy. He perpetuates the idea that racial discrimination is irrelevant in social and economic issues. He values meritocracy, for example. But in addition to strengthening this racial democracy, Bolsonaro also nullifies Gilberto Freire's historical contribution because he brings back the racial discussion to a biological field.
Sure.
Bolsonaro,
Enrique,
yeah.
sorry to interject here. We are running out of time, and I wanted just to give a quick chance to Jefferson so he can wrap up with his question, and then we can have a break.
Okay, that's great.
Yes. Sorry about that. I'm just gonna copy and paste some of these fascinating questions so we can actually curate them and you can come back to them.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to keep in touch with everyone.
Yes, I've just realized that we cannot really copy and paste. So basically it was gonna be take captions. So if anyone has any idea how to do this quicker, just let me know in the chat, please. Let's go back to you, Jefferson.
Hey, thank you, Anna, for the question. I think one of the things I am actually following is the media, the role the media plays in this history, like how the media constructs like certain imaging of a favela, which allows this kind of racial violence to take place. But regarding to how the mothers are listening or not to the media, I think like there is a strong work they are done to open channels in the media where they can be listened to. That like normally that is really punctual. That's like when the violence, like something that, for example, this week that had happened, like with the killing of the two young boys, like it comes on the media and everybody gets kind of involves themselves, the moms themselves, like listen to one another. And that's not like something small, I would say, like that has a healing character, that has a therapeutic character, there's a therapeutic like because that is also a way to handle the accusation that comes with the killing, and having someone else which is in the same situation, which is listening to you, is also a way to build again the world after this devastation of the loss, to build the world again as a place of possible relations to inhabit. So like I don't think that like this kind of ritual and demonstrations that they do, talking and speaking again and again of these histories, it's where I would say they get the best like listening. And regarding like the media and stuff like that, and even academics, I think there is also like right now they have a effort to regulate that, I would say. For example, if a journalist came to listen to them and the story is not good, they are going to like expose that, because it's not just more about you being listening, but how to be listening, how their voices are not like, let's say, still in the listening. But yeah, I think it's mainly that.
So that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Enrique and Jefferson, and to all the questions. There were some really wonderful questions which we didn't have time to get to. But should we move on to panel 2 now, Nadia? And then we can all reconvene for panel 2 at 4 o'clock. And the 2 videos to watch for panel 2 are Anna's and Martina,
yes. So
everyone can go in in their own space, watch the videos, and then we will come back and pick up the conversation discussing Ana and Martinez. Thank you so much, everyone.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ana Nenadovic. I'm a junior lecturer at the Institute for Latin American Studies at Freie Universität Berlin. And I'm really happy to be able to share some of my first findings of my new research project. And I've slightly changed today's title to Occupying Virtual Spaces, Caribbean Afrofeminisms Go Online. First of all, I'd really like to thank Nadia and Archie for organizing this event under these very special circumstances and for giving us the opportunity to share our work and to comment on each other's work and to network virtually. As I've already mentioned, I'd like to share some insights into contemporary Caribbean Afrofeminist thought and arts and activism and their struggles for visibility. I aim to show how the internet and social media have served as a means of networking and gaining visibility, and I focus on contemporary Afro-Caribbean feminist thought. But still, I'd like to look back a bit in history of the 20th century. And of course, Caribbean Afrofeminism does not start in the 20th century, but well, I had to focus on something in this talk. So it's very interesting that during the 20th century and 21st centuries, we see a circulation of Afrofeminist thought, arts and activism from the Caribbean to the US and the United Kingdom and back. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we've got the ideas of Pan-Africanism, negritude, circling the world and connecting different parts of the world through migrations and travelings of activists and artists, and two very prominent women in Pan-Africanist thought were Una Marson and Amy Jacques Garvey, both from Jamaica. Una Marson spent a long time in the UK and Amy Jacques Garvey in the United States, where they also met other activists and artists and shared their knowledge and their arts with them. So they influenced, if we look at the United States, those activists networked and influenced the Afro-American struggles during the first and second half of the 20th century, and they also had an impact on Black feminism with prominent figures like Alice Walker, Angela Davis, Toni Morrison, Patricia Hill Collins, Audre Lorde, just to mention a few. And that Black feminism circulated back to Latin America and the Caribbean, where has been referenced in the past decades by scholars like Euderquis Espinosa, Ochi Curiel, Lelia Gonzalez, Jamila Ribeiro, Cels Albert, and Patricia Mohamed. So contemporary Caribbean Afrofeminist thought is influenced by ancestral epistemologies, Pan-Africanism, negritude, Black nationalism, Black feminism, amongst others. And the topics, the issues, and the struggles are manifold, and from racism, sexism to queer activism. So that's why I always talk about Afrofeminisms in plural, not in singular. As I've already mentioned, the focus of my current investigation or of this particular talk is the impact the internet and social media have had on the networks and the struggles for visibility of Afrofeminists. from the Caribbean, and I asked Queen Zinga Maxwell, a Costa Rican poet, feminist and activist, to answer a few questions and to share her opinion on the role of the internet and social media with me. I tried to integrate her answers in the presentation, but you can't hear it if I play it, so I'm just going to synthesize it. And she stresses, especially in these current pandemic times, the importance of the internet and social media, but also on messenger services like WhatsApp, Telegram, or Zoom, as it opens possibilities to connect with feminists from different parts of Latin America and the world, to cooperate in projects, to share their projects online. They've also got projects on like a radio program that's played in Central America. And she stresses that really the internet has, and social media, messenger services have opened many more spaces for establishing networks on a transnational level. So if I'd like to focus on two islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico, where Afrofeminists have had special struggles, like in Costa Rica, for their visibility, because socialist discourses in Cuba and the discourses of democracia racial in Puerto Rico have basically denied the existence of racism, and in the case of Cuba, sexism, for a very long time. So it was activists, artists, and scholars of African descent who drew attention to the existence of these very structures, racist structures, sexist structures on the two islands, and they've used to the internet, especially blogs, for at least a decade to gain visibility for their struggle, not only within the islands, but also on a regional and global level. So I'd like to present some of these, just a few, and describe them very briefly, of these blogs. The first one is Negra Cubana Tenía que Ser, run by Sandra Abdala Alvarez Ramirez. It's been functioning already for almost a decade. She's a Cuban psychologist, blogger, activist, editor, and researcher, and currently resides in Germany, but she maintains very strong connections to Cuba and she travels there frequently. She's got her network in Cuba and the Cuban diaspora and Latin American diaspora in Germany especially, and the United States. On her blog, she comments on current news, issues that arise in Cuba, in the diaspora, but also in Europe, in Germany. And her last few posts and comments, which she shares also on Facebook and Twitter using the same name, have been on the Reto Africano, the African Challenge in Cuba. And she explains from an Afrofeminist perspective why the challenge is racist. She does not only comment herself, but she also conducts interviews with Afro-Cuban scholars, activists, artists from Cuba, from the diaspora, and she shares their work on her blog. For example, here we can see on the presentation in a small picture, Georgina Herrera. She shares the poetry of Georgina Herrera, and a blog, an article by Roberto Zurbano. Sandra Abdala Alvarez also has another blog connected to Negra Cubana Tenía que Ser, which is Directorio de Afrocubanas. that is explicitly a platform for networking and gaining visibility for Afro-Cuban women from the arts, from academia, activists, psychologists, etc. And she shares a photo of them, a brief biography, and also links to their personal home pages, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter accounts, etc. So let's move to the east, to Puerto Rico. One of the older blogs is Narrativa de Yolanda, run by Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, and a writer and scholar. And she mostly shares her own work, her own literary work, her own scholarly work, for example, her talks. She also shares information on her novels, on her poems, and her focus is really to rediscover the history of Puerto Rican women of during slavery and afterwards, and to gain visibility for the LGBTQ community, especially Puerto Rican lesbians. So she is started together with other writers and scholars to establish a different discourse on racial democracy or democracia racial in Puerto Rico. Conducting research on Instagram, which is very fun, and using the hashtag AfroBoricua, I came upon this blog and magazine, digital and print magazine, Revista Étnica, which is it's got a blog part and the part of the magazine, which can be purchased digitally or in print in the United States and Puerto Rico, and it's explicitly Afro-feminist, Afro-Rican feminist, and queer. But on both the blog and in the magazine, the editors, the journalists also share broader issues or common and broader issues concerning the Afro-Latin American communities. Their topics range from fashion to social media trends, to history, to politics, and they've got in the current issue a focus on the census in 2020 in Puerto Rico. And the principal contributor is Gloria Sacha. And I would like to mention or suggest you look at, you watch this show, this interview. It's Latino TV Austria, a Spanish-speaking show for the Latin American community in Austria, and accidentally the Dominican scholar and activist Yuderquis Espinosa is currently stuck in Vienna as she can't travel back to the Dominican Republic, and so they conducted an interview with her on the pandemic from an Afro-feminist perspective, and I was really surprised because to find it there, to see the interview with Yuderquis Espinosa, as the Latin American community and especially the Caribbean community in Austria is a very small one. So that's it for now. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Hello, everyone. My name is Martina Madaula. I am from Barcelona. I am currently here in Barcelona. However, I just finished my master's in anthropology in the University of Amsterdam a couple of months ago, where I got to write this thesis, The Collective Struggles Behind Transnational Care, a study on race, gender, and collectivity in Latin American domestic workers' daily practices in Barcelona. So as you can see, I got the chance to do fieldwork in my hometown, and I was working with these Latina women that live now in the city and perform both domestic and care jobs. So very quickly, I distributed, I won't say how I distributed my thesis in 3 chapters that study the 3 dimensions of care that these women were encountering. So the first one is how these women perform care as part of their jobs, so as part of the commodified care system. The second one would be how they perform care as part of their gender obligation, especially being mothers and daughters from afar and not being able to physically be there, but still carrying that obligation. And the third one was focused on collective care and the actions of collectivity that I observed, in which these women would care for each other. And in that 3rd chapter is where I can include, or where I included my section on activism, or on a proposal on the construction of activism. First of all, I want to start by quickly mentioning how Latina domestic workers activist movements in Barcelona and in the whole Spanish state are every time more and more common. There's lots of these expressions of activism. There is demonstration, there is manifesto readings, and they're becoming more and more popular. However, because they are more popular now, I didn't get the chance to participate with them, even though I would have wanted to. But basically, they shared with me that they are just overwhelmed with students and journalists asking them questions and wanting to spend time with them. But I did want to mention that. But yeah, from a very early stage of my fieldwork, I did observe a duality between the activist domestic workers and majority of them, and I think it's fair to say that it was a majority, the domestic workers that did not want to participate in this more like direct action-based activism. They were just not interested in it. They didn't have the time or the energy to participate in it. However, they were interested in participating in these more like daily collective actions that they were spontaneously organizing between each other. It's interesting to notice as well how most of these feminist activist discourses are focused on these the importance to create effective networks between migrant domestic workers in order to face isolation as the key mechanism to oppress these women and the women that perform these jobs. So most of the time in my fieldwork I spend it in this park. It's a park in Hospitalet. It's really close to Barcelona, but yeah, not in the city. And it's really close to an association that offers migrant women different courses in order to access to jobs. I was attending with many other Latina women to a course on basically how to take care of older people, different illnesses and the different techniques and all that. So very spontaneously, before and after the classes, the women, the students, were gathering together in this park, and they would spend the hours that they had just talking about different issues or eating ice cream, or as you can see here, they organized these spontaneous aerobic sessions that very often would develop into Latino salsa dance lessons where other people in the park would end up joining. That was also quite common. So in that day, Yvette, who was one of my research participants, shared with the group that she was offered a job as a live-in domestic worker, meaning that she was living where she was working, so it was every day of the week, and sleeping in the house. She was offered this living job for 700 euros a month. they all immediately reacted, telling her that the salary was not a lot and that she should also consider the course that they were taking together and the fact that she was already doing another job. So basically, they all concluded that Yvette should negotiate or try to discuss with the employer the salary or the amount of hours. In that particular case, Yvette shared with us the fact that she already tried to discuss that, but the employer concluded with something like, oh, you're one of those that goes to associations, and didn't really give space or room to discuss about her concerns. However, the fact that that she was able to share such complaint with other women was a very empowering action that was based on collectivity. In fact, such complaints that are shared by among care workers or domestic workers on a bus, on a park, community centers, religious centers are portrayed by Rahel Pereñas, a scholar specialized in migrant domestic workers. So they are portrayed by Pereñas' assimilation of Scott's hidden transcripts. So Scott defines such hidden transcripts as being in practice and in the offtages of power. So there are similarities with these collective actions or this complaint sharing of domestic workers. However, Pereñas completes that definition by highlighting the fact that this is a collective and not an individual concern. So the only occasion that I got to be in contact with Latina domestic worker activism during my fieldwork was through my friendship with Lourdes. And I think through my friendship with her, I got to understand how basically activism was not that appealing to most domestic workers. So the first, she's the chief coordinator of Libélulas, who is this feminist activist group of Bolivian domestic workers. And so the first day that I was going to meet her, we still didn't meet. She called me like 15 minutes before the meeting, telling me that we should do the meeting on the run, because she had to go to her son's school to enroll him in summer activities. So in the meeting, she shared something like that with me. I have cleaned 4 houses today. Then I just remembered today was the last opportunity to enroll my son in summer activities. So I had to do this before my next job in the afternoon. Later today at 7 p.m. there is the Libélulas meeting. So the activist meeting was the last thing or the last job after her multiple jobs and her job of being a mom. Another conversation that was pretty similar, I had it with Isabel, who was another of the members of Libélulas, and she expressed something like that. I am a sweeper in the mornings. I wake up at 5 and work until 2 p.m. cleaning the streets. Then in the afternoons, I also clean houses, and some days I go to an elderly care center. But in the evenings, I am a libélula, and this is the job that I enjoy the most. So again, the amount of time and energy, I think, is quite visible. That the time and energy that it needs to participate in activism when doing these kind of jobs, but also it's important to consider the vulnerable situation in legal terms that most of these women were living. So because of all of that, a lot of them shared things with me like, I do not have time for those, I am usually working or too tired to go to demonstrations. However, they were indeed very interested in participating in the spontaneous collective meetings that were happening in the park. And not because it was an easy thing to do, it also meant sometimes saying no to a job interview or going back home to a controlling or a husband or boyfriend, or just like overcoming the tiredness of their bodies, but they still were interested in getting to that park, spending time with other women, sharing their concerns, and also they got access to job referrals, they got access to courses, information, and just like knowledge on the established labor standards of their jobs. So in that sense, a woman helping another one was appearing to me as a deconstruction of activism that was happening daily and collectively. So I would just like to finish by sharing this quote by Silvia Federici, where she recalls the impossibility to build an alternative society until we put an end to the separation between the personal and the political, and between political activism and the cooperative reproduction of the everyday life. Such cooperative reproduction of the everyday life was exactly what these women were doing without the need to consider it activism, but just because it was the only space that they really found out of the oppressive structures. So yeah, until here my presentation, thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Okay, I think we have had plenty time to watch the videos from our speakers, Anna and Martina. Please feel free to send any question you have to the Q&A section, and also to tweet using the hashtag raise and space if you have any question or if you have any comment. It would be really good to have this conversation rolling on Twitter. Can anyone hear me? No? Cool. Fantastic. So let's start with Anna. Anna, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation of Afrofeminisms online. That was really interesting. I'm gonna jump in with two questions. One question is for you, is coming from Princesa. She is asking if you could comment on any difference between Afrofeminisms among Cuban women versus Puerto Rican women, and if possible, Dominican.
Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry that my presentation was the longest. I just couldn't stop chatting. I wouldn't emphasize so much differences based on a national context, because the histories, the problems, the perspectives are shared, and actually women from all over the Caribbean and feminists from Latin America, including Brazil, try to connect, to bridge, to construct bridges, to leave the national borders. So it wouldn't really focus on differences. Of course, particular problems due to Cuba's special status as socialist and to political discourses involves also different questions or problems for Cuban women or Afro-Cuban women, where they have to, on one side, the celebration, the official celebration of Afro-Cubanness, but within the national and socialist ideas. Then there's Puerto Rico, where Puerto Rican history has been eliminated, and it's only been rediscovered recently, and it's the task or the issue that many Afro feminists from Puerto Rico have assumed. And as of Dominican Republic, it's just the beginning of my project, and I haven't come to Dominican Republic so much because I don't have as many connections as to Cuba and Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic. But if you have any comments, I'd like to hear them and to learn from others.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, I would like to introduce Martina Madaula Munt. Her paper on the collectivity of activism from amongst Latina domestic workers in Barcelona, that was fascinating, on the politics of care. I would like to ask you one question, Martina. I was very interested in the use of racial identity labels. So are these Latin American women mobilizing this Latina identity? And can you tell us a bit more about their experiences embracing this identity that might differ from the ways that they might self-identify at home?
Yeah, thank you. That is actually a part of my thesis that I wanted to develop more because it's super broad. But what I encountered during fieldwork was these racial labels were mostly found through the employers' answers to my questions. Meaning, for example, the Latina care worker or domestic worker was identified by them as more caring, more loving, more family-like, mothering, whereas the Filipina domestic worker was more of a hard worker. So in this sense, I did wanted to investigate more on that. But on the other hand, the feeling that I got, I was mostly surrounded by Latina women, also because of the associations were run by Latina women in Barcelona. So there was clearly this sense of union among each other. There was also women from Africa, and they never made any distinction whatsoever. But I think one of the things that was surprising to me was how there was a sense of pride of their own conception of care that was based very much on kinship and on love, and not that much on monetary terms. And there was a sense of union in how the West was understanding this care to, for example, older people that were dying alone, like they were all the time saying, this doesn't happen in our countries. We make sure that the family is there. So in this sense, there was this sense of empowerment, also in the sense of they were the ones sustaining their families, both emotionally and economically. And that was the same for everyone. So I think this identity happened more for like common traits that they shared, that were really empowering to share among each other, than more of an nationalistic element on it.
Fantastic. Let me come back to Anna. We have a question from Alessia. She is wondering, you talked about the plurality of Afrofeminism. How do you think that the internet has influenced the external perception of this multiplicity? And has there been a change in the ways in which other feminists interact with Afro-Caribbean feminists?
First of all, I think, and what I've learned from especially Cuban and Costa Rican Afrofeminists is that they have, through the internet, they have got gained access to scholarly texts, literary texts by US American Afrofeminists, like the classics, Angela Davis, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and so on. So they started circulating them and are also translating them, and they use the internet really as an activist space to connect, to network transnationally, regardless of linguistic borders. They really try to take all the advantages of the democratic spaces of the internet. Of course, they're also attacked on the internet. That's another issue, but they really try to make the most of the online spaces, and they connect through social media, post each other's activities, texts, translate them, and just make the most of that medium, because it's also for free, and not all of them are scholars and don't have the academic field for networking and publicizing. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Let's go back to another one for Martina. This is coming from Kari, another of our speakers. Martina, can you talk about the articulation of a Latina domestic worker identity? Are there internal differentiations, and how do these play out in the interactions in the park? That's for you, Martina. This is coming from Kari.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it's pretty similar to what I was trying to explain. I don't think there were, or at least what I could see or observe, there were not these like internal differentiations among different nationalities of Latin American women. If that's the question, that's what I'm understanding. It was more of like a common Latina identity that was created through their shared experiences, through their migration experiences, through their job experiences, the relationship with their families. I think in that sense there was definitely this collective awareness of a Latina identity, but I couldn't perceive that much differentiation among different nationalities.
Great. Thank you very much. I have another question here to Anna. This is coming from Althea. Althea is asking you, Anna, can you say something about how or if Black feminists within the region engage in collective spaces of resistance or support across the linguistic divide?
They do. Many of them are bilingual, at least, because they do not only stick to the national borders, as I've already mentioned, but they include the diaspora, especially in the US, which is so close and still so far away. So they create their spaces, and as I've shown, the blog Negra Cubana Tenía que Ser, she actively tries to connect Afro-feminists not only from the Caribbean but also from the diaspora, and create spaces for them to react to her posts. She reposts posts from others, and really they use this space as an open networking space.
Okay, excellent. I have another question for Martina. Martina, this is coming from Alessia. I am interested in whether women you interact with had also worked as domestic care workers in their home countries, and if so, do their attitudes toward activism change according to the geographical location?
So none of them had a previous career as such as domestic workers or care workers. Some of them did perform these jobs in other Latin American countries, or even coming from their villages to the main cities of their countries. But this was always a job that was coming out of the migration process. Actually, they all had careers in other fields. But the main distinction that I did perceive is that the Latina women in Barcelona that were engaged in the more conventional activism did have experience in their home countries, either as scholars or just as street activists. But they both had they all had one of these experiences, so they wanted to bring this to their new destination. So that was mainly the distinction between the ones that did engage in activism and the ones that didn't. But again, I couldn't tell you regional differences, because I talked with both domestic workers not engaged in activism and activists from almost all Latin American countries.
Okay, excellent. I have a couple of questions for Anna, actually. Anna, this is coming from Natasha. Anna, thanks so much for your presentation. Just wondering if you think the use of online platforms in making these connections and building these Afrofeminist networks might reinforce existing exclusions. Do you have examples of how the virtual spaces and the networks translate on the ground to ensure that people who might not have easy access or unreliable access to the internet can access this content? For example, paper publications of online content or anything like that. Thanks.
Especially in the case of Cuba, that's really important. As of 5 years ago, the internet, people have had more access to the internet. For the past 2 years, also via mobile phones, which is really new in Cuba and really expensive, so it's not for everyone. So what's the Afrofeminists do? They have small groups, and they try to share, like they take screenshots, they download content from the internet, and they share it in offline spaces when they meet. They have their groups. They also share it via WhatsApp groups, which requires less access or less data volume. So they try to integrate those who don't have access to the internet. That works, of course, only on a national level. But for example, I'm part of a WhatsApp group, Afrofeminists and white feminists from Havana. So during the past weeks, when people have started staying indoors, they've started sharing more content via WhatsApp and Telegram and Signal. So, for example, La Reina, who's a rapper, she just started writing new songs at home, recording them on the phone and sharing them within the group. And then someone from outside Cuba asked her, is it okay if I share it on YouTube? And so there's a really tight connection between online and offline worlds, even in Cuba, where the access to the internet is still very limited.
That's very interesting. Another question for you, Anna, is coming from Matthias. I would like to know if you can share a little bit about how Cubans, Afro-Caribbean feminist position in relation to classic left ideas like resistance, revolution, oppression, and the Cuban government, if they do it at all, and if there are any difference from other Afro-Caribbean thinkers.
That's very difficult. I can't generalize. It's more on individual levels. You'll see, for example, Crudas Cubensi, who are a rap duo. They live in Texas, in Austin, I think, but they're frequently in Cuba. And they engage more with the subversive groups within Cuba. For example, the Instituto Internacional de Activismo, Hannah Arendt, which I find interesting that I would choose a German woman as name giver, but okay. The most famous activist is Tania Bruguera. So that's one of these groups. Then there is a group with a tendency to open more spaces for Afro-Cuban history, Afro-Cuban oppressions within socialist ideas. And then there are those who still do not want to position themselves pro or contra the system. So it's really based on individual beliefs. There's no general, yes, they're pro-government or contra-government.
Yes, another question to you from Catalina. Catalina is asking, is the access to internet in Cuba is limited and mostly recent? Do you think this has impacted the expression of Afrofeminism in the digital sphere?
Actually, I've already mentioned the problems, but there's many Cuban activists in the diaspora, in Europe, in the US, who are very actively engaged, and they also spread the words. They become the voices of those who don't have access to the internet, and they take it to the online world from outside Cuba, which is also, if it's not within the official discourses, it's really easier for them to post, to write about it from outside of Cuba.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you so much. If you have any other questions, there is another question for no, this has already been answered, sorry. And yes, I was interested in Martina. It was very interesting your use of James Scott, the hidden transcript, in helping you to conceptualize this idea about how domestic workers use the physical space to actually resist in an encoded way that the general society doesn't come very visible but it's a practice of resistance. Can you tell us a bit more why they chose of this particular concept of James Scott for resistance?
Sure. I mean, the choosing this concept actually came from Rahel Borenes. She's the one like actually making this parallelism first. But it was very similar to what I encountered, in the sense of like it was not a massive acts of demonstration or like massive public acts. It was more, as Scott defines, in the off stages of power and non-visible sometimes acts. And also the element that they were happening in practice. There was not necessarily a theory behind them or a discourse behind them. Sometimes there was like very innocent or unconscious ways of gathering together. So yeah, in this sense, I think it's kind of different in the sense of the use of resistance, because it was not necessarily changing the characteristics of their everyday lives. It was more an act of awareness or resilience or like endurance with their everyday life through collectivity and in practice. So I think there is parallelisms, but it's not necessarily an act of resistance in that sense.
Okay, that's great. I have a question for you, Anna. And I really like how in your presentation you think about how the virtual world is actually a key space for an active anti-racist struggle for the development of Afrofeminism, and also how you also take on board what Queen Nzinga Maxwell said about the opportunities that the internet is often is offering at these particular times in the midst of this the COVID-19 pandemic, but also for you as a researcher that has been able to use the internet for doing participant observation. So can you tell us a bit more what are the opportunities and challenges for that have emerged for you while conducting research in an online space, especially because it's quite relevant to continue your productivity in terms of gathering data through the internet? Can you tell us a bit more about that process?
It's very important, actually. WhatsApp has become the most important tool for me in the last weeks. It's not I can't really use the internet to establish connections, to establish a network, but I can keep in touch with the network I've already got. So I get, you know how difficult it is to get proper information from Cuba, from the media, be it Western or Cuban media. You always have to be very cautious. So I just asked them, friends of mine or Afro-feminist groups, to comment on current issues, also on the pandemic, on the numbers, on the declarations of the Cuban government. And they keep me up to date, even though they know I can't really participate in any activities, offline activities. They keep me posted, they keep me updated. When they ask me for materials for books, articles they can't access from Cuba, I scan them, I send them photos. It's really like being there, still being in the midst of the dialogue and feeling like part of the groups, not just an outside observer. No? So it's also been really interesting. I've just started researching on Puerto Rico, and the only contact I've got is Mayra Santos Febres, the writer and scholar, but she's not really grassroots movement, as to say. So I tried to find on Instagram, on Twitter, accounts that would tell me what else is there in Puerto Rico. That's how I came upon the online magazine, which was launched just a few weeks ago. Just try different hashtags. You know, I tried Afro Boricua, and it's a huge variety. You can see from young women on beaches posing, talking about fashion stars, to the reclaiming of Afro-Rican history, making visible prominent historical figures that were written out of textbooks, out of political discourses. So it's really interesting to see how many people really engage with Afro-Rican issues and Afro-feminist issues within Puerto Rico, and the LGBTQ community is really active on social media. So it's an opportunity to gather first ideas of what is there, what can we research about.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much. It was a very interesting way of methodology of actually navigating the current moment. If the attendees have any other question for the speakers?
I think we technically have a break, but then at the beginning of the next panel, we will watch the videos ourselves. So let's bring those together. And if we come back for the panel 3 Q&A at 5 o'clock now, so that there's time to have a break and to watch the 2 videos. And the 2 videos for panel 3 are Manuel M. Castillo and Carrie Tusing, and they are under the titles of Mayan Heritage and Land Preservation is Manuel M. Castillo's, and Carrie Tusing's is Contested Landscapes and Lived Ecologies in Northern Paraguay. And then we'll have a Q&A at 5 o'clock.
Good day to everyone. Now I'm starting this presentation with a story from Colonial times. John Stephens, in his Incidents of Travel in Yucatan, quotes, in a document of 1687, the granting of the lands around Uxmal to the ruler Lorenzo de Ivia. In his request to the Castilian king Charles II, the captain applies for nearly 4,400 hectares of land for cattle ranching. In this request, Lorenzo de Ivia argues that the concession of the lands will allow maintaining the service to the king, and also that it would not cause any damage to third parties. Furthermore, he argues that it would be a great service to God because it would prevent the Mayans of the area from performing ceremonies and carrying out detestable sacrifices. In the ruler's vision, the ceremonies were intended to worship the devil, and he found it intolerable that they were carried out every day and in public. However, the demonization of rituals and ceremonial centers as a colonial strategy was effective in this case for the expulsion of the Maya population and the dispossession of the land and heritage of Uxmal in favor of the ruler Lorenzo de Ivia. Today, Uxmal is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is, along with Chichen Itza, one of Mexico's great tourist attractions. Together with the Caribbean Sea, the Mayan heritage is promoted to global tourism and generates important income for the Mexican state. In 2019 alone, more than 43 million euros were generated in 2 archaeological sites, Chichen Itza and Uxmal. In general, more than 2 billion euros are generated by tourism in the country, and the Maya region is one of the main tourist attractions in Mexico. With these examples, I wanted, first of all, to make evident not only the discrimination and the situation of strong dependencies and inequality in which the Mayas of the 21st century live with respect to the social elites, but secondly, I wanted to illustrate how the colonial structures remain in place in the country. And this is why the major Maya ceremonial centers remain in the control of the states, and the Mayas are denied from the right to control, management, and development of their own cultural heritage. You're probably wondering, what happened to the Mayas in the 21st century? Well, some of them are selling crafts in the ancestral sites, but even in the Maya ceremonial centers, the Mayas today are not welcome. They give a bad image to tourism, according to some representatives of the state. On the contrary, they are a good image when they work as waiters, cooks, bartenders in the hotels owned by the social elites in Mexico. Of course, not all is black or white. In this presentation, I would also like to show you how the Maya movements are maintaining a struggle of resistance against colonial structures and for human rights in the present. In fact, my work focuses on deepening the Maya movements for human rights within the socio-cultural and political landscape in the 21st century. That is, within the contextual universe of the 21st century. I am interested in tracing and mapping these social movements to better understand what I call the contextual universe and how this influences and triggers indigenous Maya movements nationally and internationally. As an example, I would like to refer to the project called Maya Train, which is currently being promoted by the Mexican state in the Maya territory. This project has been criticized by the Maya movements for cultural appropriation, with the use of the term Maya being that is being promoted by the state and private and multinational investors. The project is not only a train, but an integral project of territorial ordering, infrastructure, economic growth, and sustainable tourism, according to the official version of the state. While there are contradictory versions about the project's viability, it's not my intention to go into them in depth, but rather to show with a couple of examples how several Maya communities have mobilized in defense of human rights and how this project in the contextual universe influences and shapes this mobilization. Since the announcement of the project, the government initiated a public consultation to inform the population and obtain their opinion on the process. However, the consultation was not intended to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of the Maya communities. This is why the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Mexico stated in December 2019 that the indigenous consultation process on the Maya Train has not complied with all the international human rights standards. In spite of this, and in the middle of the quarantine decreed by the COVID-19, the project has been launched since the beginning of May 2020. The indigenous movement has not been slow to react and have promoted legal resources to stop the work due to the risk to the health of indigenous communities. A federal judge granted the suspension of the work in favor of the indigenous communities. Meanwhile, researchers alert on the threats to cultural heritage from the impact of the development project, which includes new cities, industrial parks, agro-industrial parks, wind farms, tourism, and even an archaeological park. The scholars argue that the government institutions in Mexico, particularly heritage institutions, are acting in disregard of the law protecting archaeological monuments. For their part, several indigenous organizations went to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights requesting precautionary measures to protect the underground aquifers at risk from the industrial development mega project. Several communities have also mobilized to carry out mapping of archaeological sites or sacred sites in order to promote the protection in the face of this mega project and others that already existed in the area. On the other hand, for less than 3 years, another indigenous mobilization has been taking place against the pilot plan for planting transgenic soybeans in the area, which in addition to serious environmental impact, has also destroyed archaeological sites. As we can see, the Maya indigenous movements are developing in the political, legal, cultural, and environmental spheres, and in this example, are being triggered by master plans that threaten the rights as indigenous people. That is why, in order to better understand the complexity of these problems, I propose to analyze in detail the contextual universe where these movements arise and develop. That is, I am interested in deepening the sociocultural, economic, and political context and how that context is also shaped by colonial relics of the past or coloniality of power, as Quijano mentions, social and institutional racism, inequalities, poverty, religious intolerance, capitalism, neoliberalism, corruption, drug trafficking, feminicide, patriarchy, and so on. Thank you very much.
Te mai taikuera, tilewi, Mapuche retawi. Greetings from southern Chile from Mapuche lands. I'm Carrie Tusing, and today I will be talking briefly about contested landscapes and lived ecologies in northern Paraguay. To situate us, Paraguay is the landlocked country in red, and the region where I work is Concepción and Amambay along the Brazilian border. This used to be part of a vast upper Atlantic Paraná forest. And this picture is to give you an idea of what it looked like. It covered about 75% of the region in 1973. And this is a national park, Cerro Corá, so it's not without interventions, but this is a good idea of what the extensive subtropical forest looked like across the entire region. What I'll be talking about first is the relationship between deforestation and racialization. 61% of the forest has been lost between 1973 and 2018, so only 12% of the forest cover remains. What you're seeing here is what the landscape currently looks like. It is a patchwork of cattle ranches and indigenous communities, campesino colonies, as well as some GM monocropping. And so what we're seeing here is the material reordering of plants and animals on Paraguay's landscape, which directly impacts campesino and indigenous livelihoods. In order to understand how the landscape looks today, I draw upon theories of settler colonialism, particularly Patrick Wolf, Elizabeth Povinelli, and Glenn Coutard, to think about the way that power acts in order to make commensurate these different kinds of livelihoods. And in particular, I want to think about how the right to land, which is a fight and a struggle that is very important in Paraguay, given that almost all of the land is held in the hands of elites. This right to land has been translated by the settler state into the right to property. So it's a way that the diversity of livelihoods and claims and needs to have relationships to land are all inscribed within these legal codifications of property. Now, the different kinds of property that are available to people are different based on what their racialized makeup is. And it's important to realize that this production of racial difference over time, this mestizaje that occurred in Paraguay and continues to occur, is at once a production of space and property. When we think about the way that racialized identities are carried out on the landscape, we can look at satellite activities. Huang et al. Looked at different periods of time in order to see the rates of deforestation in the region. And what they saw was they were able to identify different patterns of deforestation based on people's livelihoods. Now, this is a bit simple, but for the moment, before I unpack it, we'll look at this and see that we can see the ways that campesinos carry out their livelihoods on the ground in Figure C, as opposed to these large-scale cattle ranches and soy farms in Figure D. And the common narrative in Paraguay is that the campesino colonists are to blame for deforestation, and that they go into a place, they settle down, they cut all the trees, they sell off the timber, and then they fail to actually successfully carry out their homesteading bid, and so then they move somewhere else, and they move around the land, and they're like these locusts who are eating up the forest. These catucaru is how you would say that in Guarani. But in reality, what Huang et al. See is that 80% of the deforestation of this upper Paraná Atlantic forest is due to these large-scale and medium-scale cattle ranchers and industrial agriculturalists. So we really need to put into question this idea that the campesino colonists are at fault, quote unquote, for deforestation. And what we really see is that the way that extractive ecologies work is that colonists and indigenous people began to sell the trees and their timber as their land was titled and organized along these settler colonial logics. So accusing campesinos of selling off timber or accusing indigenous people for selling off timber, well, it is important to really understand that, you know, we need to refuse to place marginalized people in this exclusive othered category of these ecological people, because this challenges us to confront the really difficult struggle to navigate and survive on the ground through these kinds of extractive industries. So we need to really question the fact that campesinos are held to blame for selling timber, whereas those who are buying the timber, the elites that are organizing the timber, and how the state is organizing the possibilities of carrying out a livelihood that is oriented to food production and not towards the market is severely limited. So this is the racialization of deforestation, of blaming the marginalized for those difficult decisions that they have to navigate, and not holding the larger structural inequities to task for the kind of narrow choices that they are being made to take. So property in Paraguay then is arbitrated through the production of those racialized identities that began with colonialism. This becomes both institutional and everyday in relation to power, and it's inscribed on the landscape. So let's look at how this actually goes on the ground, go from the satellite images to the ethnography. We see monocropping, the soy field in Concepcion, just soy as far as you can see. Cattle ranches. Some cattle ranches also are money laundering fronts for different smuggling operations or marijuana plantations. Paraguay, this region of Paraguay is one of the largest marijuana producers in South America. And some of that money is funneled back into cattle ranching to launder the money. But there's also a very strong cattle culture in the area. And so there's a lot of traditional cattle ranchers as well. This drastically changes the landscape. And then at a very different scale, campesino colonies are also moving into this forest and taking and chopping down some trees and changing the local environment. And these small homestead plots are part of this process of accumulation by dispossession. So though campesinos are promised a place within the land and their own plot of land, what this ends up doing is that it opens the land that they perhaps might choose to focus on food production. Through titling, it obliges it to become part of the land market. So what we also need to think about when we think about landscape are these companion species to colonialism. So again, at very different scales, campesinos might be growing crops for market and selling excess. They might be grazing cattle for leche, for milk, or for their own consumption, which is at a very different scale from the industrial cattle slaughter. And these also are concurrent to the pasto colonial, which is guinea grass in an indigenous community. You can see here I'm about 6 feet tall, like 1.83 meters, and it's over my head. It grew in about a month or so. So these material changes are introduced through private property. And even if indigenous communities are safeguarded and given title and taken off of the market, they're still surrounded by these particular ecologies, which I call colonial industrial ecologies. So indigenous communities, if they wish to continue to have their forests, nevertheless, they are still surrounded by these kinds of extractive industries. What that comes into is that there's privatized landscapes of settler colonialism. Nevertheless, there are emergent and remnant ecologies that persist within these landscapes. So the alignment of the settler colonial monohistory, the monocropping, and the mono-ranching inscribe a violence of dispossession on the landscape. And it attempts to render rural livelihoods incommensurate to this modernity. However, there are still slippages that remain. For example, the persistence of orange trees on the landscape. Here we see a dispossessed campesino home. It was surrounded by citrus trees, and it's been converted into a cattle pasture, but the plants itself still remain. So if we know how to read a landscape, we can still see that there are emerging and remnant ecologies that persist within these different kinds of capital industrial ecologies. I use the word kwe when I think of this. This kwe in Guarani is a remnant. It's a word that signifies the past and a continuing situation. And so to think through this metaphorically, I use the word kwe to also think of the persistence of Guarani communities. So when I told an indigenous woman about, when I was writing my field notes about the rings of citrus trees, well, she told me as well that you can see the livelihoods, the Guarani livelihoods that are still inscribed in the landscape, like Taperekwe, which are the old footpaths, or Ogakwe, which is the fallen houses. And so there is a persistence of these different kinds of lives that are still carried out on the landscape despite their marginalization. And so taking into account the campesino allotments that attempt to focus on food production, I think of these as indigenous and agroecologies. So key to understanding how this works, right, is that these things are implicated together, and there's different power relationships that affect the material ordering and reordering of crops on the ground. So in order to conclude and to leave us with perhaps some more things to talk about, I'd like to think about these ideas of ownership and responsibility. So I followed this indigenous leader to look at this patch of forested land that we see she's looking toward. And I slept poorly that night, and I talked in my sleep, and she told me that the owner of the land had entered me when we were there visiting, and that we needed to visit the land more so that the owner would be able to understand me more, and I would be able to understand the land more. And we were looking at a way to incorporate that forested land to expand her community. And I think the the takeaway that I'd like to leave us with is to think about how in Guarani, the idea of ownership is flipped. So in fact, there are spirits that are responsible to the land and for the land. And so instead of the spirits owning the land, the spirits themselves are owned by the land. And these owners and these spirits exist beyond these idea of property and divisions, but they are definitely impacted by it as this property regime reorganizes the Paraguayan landscape.
Okay, thank you everybody for sticking with us and for managing this strange format, but so far the conversation has been really fascinating, so thank you. And thank you to Manuel May Castillo and to Carrie Tusing for their papers. I think let's jump straight in with a question from the chat to Carrie from Peter Wade. Asking, is there a straightforward relationship between campesino and indigena and between medium, large-scale agro-industrialist and non-indigenous? Do you want to take that straight away, Carrie?
Thank you. Just to make sure the audio is working. Thank you, Peter, very much for your question. I think I'm not sure what you mean by straightforward, but I'll take a stab at it. I think what I'm trying to pull out and tease out in looking at these different relationships is that there is a relationship between all of these groups, and I think what articulates that those different nexus between them is a relationship of labor and livelihoods that is mediated through these different relationships to the landscape. And if we go on the ground and look at a quote-unquote campesino community or indigenous community, what we can see is that there's a lot of, there's no such thing as just a completely campesino community where only campesinos live. Perhaps there's an indigenous family that are living as caretakers on a campesino lot, or within an indigenous community, there might be a Guarani woman who's married to a campesino man, and she's living off of the community lands. So there's not this like ideal type definition of what we can think of as an indigenous person or a campesino, or even these large-scale agro-industrious and non-indigenous people, especially in Paraguay. The use of Guarani, I think, is an interesting facet that helps us to think about how the definition of what is or who is not indigenous is a very historical relationship. So we need to think about these relationships of power over time. I think it's interesting, some people here in Latin America even say that, oh, Paraguay's done such a great job with recognizing its indigenous people, but what they're talking about are Guarani speakers. And about 85% of the Guarani speakers in Paraguay do not consider themselves to be indigenous people. So, and to follow up with your question, thank you, non-indigenous campesinos are also racialized into this category of becoming citizens. So through their homesteading process on the land, what the racialized discourse is that they are becoming full citizens by becoming landowners in that process. So they are also taken up into these different relationships of property making and incorporated into this land market system, where unfortunately many times it becomes very easy for them to lose their land based on those structural factors. Like there's a lot of government support, they might not have seed saved, and so there's these processes that lead to expulsion of campesinos from land that they might have access to. Thank you for your question, and I'd like to continue this conversation.
Sorry, I muted myself again. Thank you, Carrie. Manuel, could you maybe take the two questions that have come up in the chat together, one from Enrique and one from Blanca? The first in relation to mechanisms of public consultation, which are, as Enrique notes, contaminated with racist practices and might look like an opportunity for Indigenous people that in fact aren't. In addition, maybe you could take Blanca's question of whether or not there's any possibility that tourism can kind of allow people to identify with minor culture.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this very lively and interesting and profound discussion. Yes, in response to Enrique, I would say that there are many factors that is affecting the whole discussion on the consultation. Racism is one of them, I would say. And there is a tricky part here. I'm sorry, I'm hearing myself. That's confusing.
It's gone again.
So I was saying that there is a tricky part here. Since the consultation has been misused and misunderstood by the states in general, in Latin America, but especially in Mexico. The consultation, according to the ILO Convention and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is meant to obtain the consent. So it's not only consulting, right? It's not that, do you want to train? But rather, could you approve that you want to train? And by written, and there is a protocol, right? So this process is not being completed by the current government, and they only did like a political gatherings where they were asking, well, who of you want to have a train? But of course, mainly of the public there were followers of the same political party of the government, right? So most of them were raising their hands, and that has been taken as a consultation, right? But this is why the office in Mexico of the Human Rights High Commissioner stated that it was not fulfilling the international standards, that has a protocol to follow, right? And in the end, it ends up with a document in which Maya communities should state that they do agree with that they give a consent, right? This is one of the things. And the other thing is the consultation has been made broader to involve more people, like the population in the cities. And there is where I think comes racism in discussion, because people from the cities do not have the same understanding of heritage and environment and environmental protection and so on as indigenous peoples, but they are more in quantity. I mean, there are more population that can vote in that sense, right? And so in order to avoid the protocol for consultation, they involve more people from cities that basically are in favor of the developmental programs of the government, right? And of course, mainly in the cities, there are people who are non-indigenous, or let's say, as they some of them are called mestizo, but also Spanish descendants and other peoples that have a different worldview, right? So it's quite complex, but I would say that in that sense, indigenous people are trying to be put aside through the process of consultation by involving more people, right? But the consultation is meant to obtain the consent of indigenous people.
Thank you. Yep. Carrie, I wonder if you wanted to take this question from Paula Bastos. Are there any Brasileños involved in illegal land grabbing? And about the land property ownership framework, I wondered if I could add a question on there myself, which is that I was really interested in towards the end of the paper, you talk about Guarani conceptions of ownership, which invert the idea of property and the spirits which do not own the land but are owned by the land. And I was really interested in where that, in that concept, what is the kind of, well, I'm interested in the translation of it. As I'm interested in translation, what is the idea of ownership a kind of accurate, and it's not a critique of your translation, but it's a question about the translation. Is that an accurate and kind of translation of a Guarani concept of ownership itself, which can therefore be inverted, or is it a different kind of set of relations? And I think there is a connection there between questions of modalities of ownership.
Thank you both for your questions. Paula, yes, when I refer to the monocropping and the cattle ranching, most of the elite ranchers in the Concepcion region are still Paraguayan, but in the Amapay region, which is closer to Brazil in the sense that there's an open land border, it's not a river border. So there's an incredible amount of Brasiguayo presence, and Portuguese is spoken in the region where I worked. A lot of the indigenous people are at least trilingual because they speak Spanish, Guarani, Portuguese, and then also their dialect of Guarani as well. And what we're seeing with this land grabbing is what the border does in this region is that it creates this money vacuum in a way, and that land right across the border in Mato Grosso do Sul is 3 times as expensive as it is across the border in Paraguay. There's a lot of influx of Brazilians who are able to maybe sell away their land in Mato Grosso, and they come in and they're able to really expand their holdings in Paraguay. The border region, for I think maybe 15 years or so, it was illegal for Brazilians to own land on the border. But I think it's really important to consider legal structures in Paraguay as some kind of perhaps aspirational laws, where there are a lot of really great laws on the books, but in practice, the legal system does not enforce them. Indigenous lands in Paraguay are taken out of the market. They're not allowed to be rented or sold constitutionally. But if an indigenous leader goes and does a simple notary transfer between a landowner and himself, and that goes through the court system at the local level, the landowner will end up, probably winning his case unless it goes much further along, which we see with the 3 emblematic cases in the Chaco region. And wonderful, Paula, let's continue to talk about Brasiguayos. It was difficult for me to gain access to Brasiguayos. They were very suspicious of my research work, but I have a small sample of about 8 people, and putting their landholding size together, it actually covered a lot of territory. And to link to this concepts of ownership itself, I think it's really provocative and important to think about the ways that translations occur across languages, and different concepts are also impacted through that. So Jara in Guarani, or Jaru in Paitubutera Guarani, is translated into Spanish as dueños. So if you have someone who is Uvujara, they're the dueño de la tierra, they're the owner of the land. But that doesn't mean that is that encompasses the actual Guarani meanings of ownership, right? And so there's a parsing that happens, and there's a simplification that happens. And when I've written about this, what I tried to think about as well is these concepts of translating that we can see in Paige West's commentary about translation in, I think it's in Ethnos with Jimmy Ninani and Haynes, who put this together, that these kinds of commensurability and these kinds of translations, what she was talking about was translating from and the concepts to NGOs, so that those different concepts will be safeguarded. But what we're seeing here, I think, is a lot of times these Guarani concepts are translated into Spanish, which is a Colonial language, and so it's sort of a parsing, it's a glossing, and it's a simplification. And in fact, it's in the imposition of this Colonial concept of ownership into a Guarani translation that doesn't fit. But that's not to say that the Guarani don't use the word Yara to signify ownership now, because they are talking about their communities as private property, whereas 30 years ago, they would reject the idea of their communities as private property and talking more about their tecoja, which is the area where their livelihood intersects and articulates with the land. I'm sorry, I blathered on about that, but complicated questions, I very much appreciate them.
That's fascinating, thank you. Really interesting stuff. I wanted to come back to two other questions, one for each of you that are in the Q&A. Manuel from Alicia, interested in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and access to historical cultural sites, and relating to Machu Picchu in Peru, changes that have improved access for locals and free access for citizens. Has there been any similar push in Mexico? And if you want to take that first, but then afterwards, Carrie, if you could answer Maria's question on how do you see technology interacting with Indigenous peoples or farmers, for example, for agricultural purposes?
Yeah, may I briefly reply as well? Who was Blanca, I think, who asked about the tourism and the positive impact. I forgot, I'm sorry, Blanca. Yes, sure, I think it has a positive impact. I don't want to put black and white, to depict a black and white picture of it, in particular of tourism. The problem here is that who controls heritage to sell to tourism as a market product is a group that has been ruling the country for centuries, right? For almost 5 centuries, and that's a problem because according to now the tourism development on human rights, the Maya people have the right to control and develop that heritage. And the problem is that most of the income that's coming to the country is not being directly reflected into the lives of Maya people. And that's the main problem. I mean, it's a very huge and important income that tourism brings to the country. And these resources might be used for better education, hospitals, and reducing violence, and so on, but it's not like that. So when I'm mentioning tourism, in that sense, I'm not focusing on the negative impact of people coming to the country, right? But rather who control the access to touristic places and the resources. This is for Blanca. I'm sorry, I hope that I briefly answered that question. And regarding Alicia, the relations between Indigenous or Maya peoples and cultural heritage in Mexico, at least in Yucatan, in the Maya area, is quite different. Indeed, Maya people have to identify themselves or ourselves as Mexicans in order to get access to archaeological sites. And not only that, we have to pay for that. And it's almost 500 pesos, that it's about 25 euros if we change it into currency. And that's almost impossible for most of the Maya people to get access to our own heritage, right? And not only that, it's once the sites are controlled by the heritage institution, it's difficult for spiritual leaders to go back there and to perform ceremonies, right? And some of them were also accused in the past or reported to police by as looters, to give you an example. So there are many ways in which the access to cultural heritage has been blocked by policy making, and so it's kind of complex and difficult to the other countries, in relation to other countries like in Peru. And I hope that in the future this will be changed thanks to the Maya movements, and that's also a topic I'm interested on now from our research, I would say.
Thank you. Carrie, I wonder if you could also take, just as well as the question on technology, could you also respond to Joel Correa and question on whether you see the racial arbitration of private property and its inscription on the landscape in Paraguay as distinct from other settler colonial geographies in Latin America? Maybe you could wrap those two questions together as well.
Okay, thank you. Mario, technology interacting with indigenous and farmers' agricultural purpose. Well, I guess it also depends on what you think of as technologies. Of course, there's a lot of indigenous agricultural technologies that incorporate like multiple crops on the same area of land, and then with the rotating slash and burn, or what Richard Reed calls agroforestry, there's a regrowth of the forest around these homes, and then they might move on somewhere else. But larger scale technology, especially with campesinos, there's World Bank and UN programs that are doing like seed and also planting like hybrid corn in campesino communities. And this has caused some more deforestation just because of the way that the machinery has to enter the campesino community lots. And so they'll have to cut down trees because it's a large, wide machinery that is doing liquid planting. And some campesino communities have organized against that government offering and are asking for criollo seeds or local seeds. And so there's a very heterogeneous kind of response to like large scale industrial technologies in the region. And thank you, Joel, for your question. That is not a quick question. That is a very big question. But I think that I'll give an example from here in Chile. I'm in southern Chile in Mapuche lands, and the kinds of what I'm starting to think about is different kinds of property laws and how that impacts the inscription of the landscape change. And of course, there's similarities in that land is being turned over, and so there's land lost. I think in all of the cases, what we can see is a reduction of land access for indigenous people, despite the fact that these fight for lands are I don't want to say legitimate, because who cares what my opinion is about if they're legitimate or not, but they what they are doing is fighting for the rights for people's access to land, and not just for property. But in southern Chile here, what we see is a mosaic of different kinds of title. So there's these very old title when this was the frontier with the Chilean state. There's also individual lots that were given to specific family members. And then there's community lands that are larger. And so what we see is, I think, a greater variety of the ways that indigenous people have access to land. But that also makes it, there's a lot of red tape in that there's a confusion of the different ways that indigenous people have rights to land. And if it's not inscribed in one particular government authority, CONADI, then supposedly it's not registered as indigenous, but that's not what the law actually says. And so I think that we should continue to talk about this. And with the case of the Chaco region in Paraguay, the tracts of land are much larger as well. So even thinking about how much land is supposed to be designated to Indigenous people according to property laws will greatly impact the way that the landscape looks like.
So we'll just carry on we've got 5 more minutes for this session. Well, we'll extend it by 5 minutes to make five minutes. So if anybody has any final questions, I had then put them in the chat or Q&A now. Here we go. So could you, Carrie, could you expand on how you're thinking, in response to Anna, about settler colonialism in this context? Here's the notion very productive to understanding ongoing forms of turning land into property. How you're thinking about how your work modifies settler colonialism beyond the dichotomy between settler and indigenous to make a complex series of overlapping forms of land struggle between state elites and campesinos and indigenous people. I was interested also in, and it's kind of related, but you may not have time in 4 minutes, but in the way that you talk about racialization in relation to property, and that racialization is a kind of process over time of the production of space and property. But it seems to me that you're also showing that it's about the production of nature, as Neil Smith would call it, and that somehow the production of nature is part of processes of racialization as well, in ways that maybe could be expanded on in relation to questions like settler colonialism. So maybe you could pick up on either of those in the last few minutes. Thanks.
Yes, Anna, thank you very much for your question. What I'd like to continuously hold in mind as I look through these different situations is that complexity, is that there's this overlapping system and different forms. And in order to keep that in mind, I think a historical approach with political economy in mind is one of the ways that we're going to be able to make sure that we are holding account the complex ways that power relationships have changed over time. That's not new, but I think that that's useful to highlight. And that dichotomy of settler and indigenous as well. I was part of a panel at AAA's in Toronto, I guess 2 years ago now. I've lost all notion of time here in enclosure. And indigenous people have been moved around. To give an example of the United States, the Navajo had to, were moved from the northern part into Arizona and resettled, and it's still considered this area of northern Arizona is their native lands or their traditional lands, and so that doesn't make their claim any less valid. The fact that they've had to move around the landscape, I think what we might want to keep in mind is that there's this constant relationship and orientation to land and nature, to move into the next question, that we can consider as a way of saying, well, sure, we're not interested in delegitimizing people's claims to different areas of land by saying these people are indigenous and these people are settlers, but rather everyone has the right to land. Basis, and then everyone has to work out the different ways that they are related to land, and we should consider that relationship over time. And as far as the production of nature, I thank you very much for bringing Smith into the conversation. This production of nature is, this mutual co-production of society and nature. There's not this dichotomy. And I think our next section, when we talk about the rural-urban divide, that's also this kind of, we need to start continually think about that blurring. And this to historicize nature, again, is I think one way that we can think about production of nature is a kind of racialization, in the fact that looking at settler colonialism, it's imposing a particular kind of relationship to nature as the correct, legitimate way that we should engage with nature. And we see this with Brasiguayos talking about indigenous people as being backwards or lazy. Campesinos have said that to me about indigenous people. You know, they were in the Stone Age and they don't know how to relate to land. And so these kinds of comments about the rational use of land and what land is unproductive or not is also a racial process in reading nature and defining what nature is appropriate and what kind of relationships are appropriate to have with nature. And so I've been thinking about that as like the nexus of labor with nature. And so I've been talking about that as livelihoods. And so drawing on the work of Gavin Smith and Gaston Gordillo to think about like space and livelihoods has been one of the ways that I've been approaching that question and trying to figure things out. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. That was really wonderful and an excellent link to the last panel. I think we'll have to save the last couple of questions. Yes, Manuel May, I think you've already responded, but we'll have to save those. But thank you both very much. It was really, really rich and fascinating. Thank you. So we will now move into our last panel, which involves all of us retreating again into ourselves to watch the final two videos. In the last session, there are actually 3 presentations, but Catalina will present live. So first, let's watch the 2 videos together. Blanca on the geographies of Ipanema Beach and Olivia on environmental determinism in Bolivia. And then we'll come back together and then we will listen to Catalina's presentation before having a Q&A with everybody.
Hi, everyone. My name is Blanca, and I'm going to be sharing my research titled Destabilizing Urban Social Relations, Exploring the Geographies of Ipanema Beach, Rio de Janeiro. I really hope you are going to find interested what I'm about to tell you, and at least that the photos of the beach make confinement a little bit more soothing, and that it brings useful points of discussions to the webinar. So what I really sought to research was the extent in which social interactions on Ipanema Beach reproduce or transform wider urban relations. And here, what I was looking at was whether the wider patterns of Rio de Janeiro are whether they're reproduced in Ipanema Beach or whether there's unique singularities of Ipanema Beach. And I really looked at the popular imaginations of the beach as a democratic public space, as well as I conceptualized beach economic informality as a sociable practice that actually enacts sociability through its practice as well as care. And different aims and significances that I had, and this really do relate to this conference theme, were the singularity of Ipanema Beach, studying it according to pre-existing local theories of that space, rather than using Western notions of urban public space, because really, if we want to look at non-Western spaces, according decolonially, we need to look at them according to their own terms. I also wanted to produce optimistic, forward-looking research in which Latin American theory is really used productively and positively to draw lessons from within. And lastly, by focusing on beach economic informality, I wanted to give visibility and representation to the often invisibilized precarious beach workforce. And I think all of this can be encompassed in a post-colonial methodology, which I think is very worth mentioning because it really does bring together theory and practice. Because I used post-colonial theory and put it into practice through a critical methodology that attempted to speak to and abide by this place and acknowledge the problematizations in academic research and seeking to undo them. And I did this in 3 different ways. First of all, translating regional scholarship from Brazilian Portuguese to English to counter structural imbalances of academia and promote circulation of knowledge. Second of all, by primarily using Brazilian scholarship out of geographical responsibility. And lastly, by carrying out my research bilingually so it can be of use to the represented communities. Now, I've given you a brief background of the research and of the decolonial aspects behind it, and now I'm going to move into the findings, which I've broken down to make it clearer for you. So, the geographies of Ipanema Beach. Perhaps the most important finding of this research is that the social-spatial interactions of Ipanema Beach construct a space of coexistence that actually destabilizes wider urban patterns of segregation, inequality, and racism. Now, this doesn't seek to deny the fact that these patterns do exist, and it doesn't seek to romanticize a beach space, but it does seek to produce productive and positive research, because there's already plenty of research about the myth of the beach as a democratic public space. And frankly, in the context of Brazil, where democracy is notorious for its crumbled structures, I think it's hardly innovative to talk about the lack of democracy. So instead, I wanted to look at the democratic potentialities of the beach. And I think this can be seen through what I've called cohabiting, horizontality, and anonymity. Anonymity, I think, is behind my camera, so apologies for that. All of these embody difference and in this social, in this space of coexistence. And I'm really borrowing from Baba, who really says that we should not think of difference as something negative, but we should acknowledge it as a tool that articulates difference and enriches culture. And so, for example, in terms of cohabiting, what do I mean by that? This idea ascribes to the fact that the beach space is actually a space that is an assemblage for various identities. And it's one of the only spaces in Rio, or at least one of the most routinely spaces in Rio, in which this multiplicity comes together so often. And that links to horizontality, which is the idea that technically everyone has access to the beach, right? And although we know that's not exactly true, what that means is that society tends to think of the beach as a democratic public space. And that means that people tend to be more tolerant and respectful because they know they're going to have to coexist with difference. It doesn't mean that people are actually more tolerant, but it means that in relation to other urban public spaces, people are. And lastly, in terms of anonymity, this alludes to the myth that everyone is the same in the beach because everyone's just reduced to a bathing suit. And the thing is that sort of tries to get rid of difference. But again, borrowing from Baba, we shouldn't try to hide difference. What we should do is demand it be considered, right? And as such, what the beach actually is place to make political claims, and it's a very highly valorized place because it's very globally diffused, Ipanema Beach, and it's in an elite neighborhood, and so political claims can be performed to a wider audience. So when the periphery comes to Ipanema Beach, actually, they're actually achieving sort of to transform the wider urban order of Rio de Janeiro, and reflecting how this space is actually hugely significant as a space for political possibility in Rio. Now, we've talked about these sort of positive outlooks of the beach space, but we cannot do that and we cannot do that and disregard how wider urban patterns of segregation, inequality, racism, and injustice are reproduced. And just to give you an idea, they are reproduced I've grouped it in three different sort of categories: relational mobility, Ipanema's demophobia, and racialized conflict. What do I mean, for example, with relational mobility? That's the idea that the beach space and its relational linkages to the wider city determines how spatial segregation happens at the beach. So for instance, depending on where you're coming from, if you're coming from public transport or if you're coming from the neighborhood, you sit in different strips of sand. And that really demonstrates the fragmentation that you can see elsewhere in the city. Which leads me to the second point, Ipanema's demophobia, which is, by the way, a concept coined by Brazilian scholar Hugening. And it alludes to the idea that Ipanema's elite is scared of the other and therefore tries as much as possible to subjugate the movement of peripheric Black bodies to the beach. You can see in the bottom left photo how that's taking place right there and there. And it's a very common practice, trying to increase public transport fares, trying to cut bus routes, and all sorts of things that attempt to vandalize the Black body and sort of justify its not coming to the beach because it'll bring danger. However, what that leads to is the third point, racialized conflict, in which what we see in Ipanema Beach is a very, very strong presence of military police that is constantly surveilling, but it's only ever constantly surveilling Black bodies, as you can see in the top left photo, and this was during research. And they are surveyed for doing the exact same things as white body, but simply because they're Black, they're being policed. And what you can see in this is a very clear reproduction of the racist structures of Brazilian democracy on the beach space, and a further marginalization of the urban poor and a denial of the right to the city. Now, moving on, I've talked about the space of coexistence in Ipanema Beach. And now I'm going to move on to the second bit of findings, which relates to beach economic informality and the role that it has within this space of coexistence. And findings show that the space of coexistence is actually enhanced by the practice of economic informality, because through its movement, it actually enacts sociability and care throughout the beach, which makes the beach a space that actually transgresses wider urban relations and broadly transforms them. So what do I mean by that, for example? There are inherent sociable structures, internal structures in beach economic informality. As you can see in the right, these shacks, for example, they're completely family-led. They are not ridden of hierarchies, but they are able to demonstrate affective relationships and convivial and sociable relations in this beach work environment. And that's actually sort of diffused through the external interactions that economic informality enacts. And it's not only sociability that is diffused, but the care, the geographies of care that also pertain to economic informality and its networks of solidarity are also diffused through interactions between beachgoers and beachgoers, beachgoers and beach workers with beach workers. And for example, David Luiz, this mache seller to the left, as well as this couple in the middle, all are examples of all the people that actually talked about how gratifying is having interactions at the beach that enact sociability and allow you to get to know more about people that otherwise, if it wasn't for this given space, you would never talk to. And so, and in terms of care, what you can also see is people caring for each other in ways that could not be possible in any other urban public space in Rio. So I'm gonna leave it at there, keep it brief, but I just wanna show with these examples that Ipanema Beach really is a very important space for political possibility in Rio, and really gives us lessons of care and sociability and a coexistence of difference that we may be able to take and apply elsewhere in the city. And that shows how we don't have to look elsewhere for solutions about how to undo patterns of inequality and segregations, that the solutions lie within us. And this is a perfect case that shows that, and that really creates post-colonial and forward-looking research that has an objective to do better in it. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting, and I hope we can discuss more in the webinar. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Olivia Arrigo Stiles, and the title of my presentation today is Elite Constructions of Race and Space in Bolivia, 1900 to 1950. I am a second-year PhD student at the University of Essex. My interdisciplinary PhD traces the history of ecological thought within highland indigenous movements in 20th century Bolivia. I examine the extent to which radical indigenous politics in Bolivia shaped new understandings of the environment and repurposed the natural world as a sphere of political contention. What I'm presenting today is a draft chapter which addresses the earlier years covered in my project, so 1920 to 1950, when the natural world became the locus of analysis for reformist politicians and intellectuals in Bolivia. This chapter draws on sources retrieved through 5 months research in national archives in La Paz and Sucre, as well as from collections housed in the British Library. By drawing on a register of political and cultural writings from Bolivian intellectuals between 1920 and 1950, I explore how conceptualizations of geography overlapped with understandings of race in Bolivia. I focus on selected writings by Bolivian ensayistas Jaime Mendoza, Pastor Valencia Cabrera, Daniel Perez Velasco, and Arturo Vilela. These thinkers conform to a telluric tendency that emerged in Bolivia in the early 20th century, which Bolivian intellectual Guillermo Francovich later described as La Mística de la Tierra. The texts penned by these místicos arose in the context of elite debates around the Indian problem, or in other words, the role that indigenous peoples should play in the modern nation state. Their writings reveal a pervasive concern with the natural world and its inhabitants as an obstacle to nation building and economic reform in the early 20th century. I attempt to address the question as to why geography and specifically the Andean highlands, became so important to elite understandings of race in early 20th century Bolivia. Theories linking the natural world and racial characteristics had circulated in Europe and the Americas since the Enlightenment. By the 20th century, the doctrine of environmental determinism, or the belief that the physical environment dictates societal development, became increasingly popular across the Americas and would have a decisive impact in the nation-building projects undertaken by Bolivian elites in the pre-revolutionary years, so before 1952. The concepts of race and space have attracted increased attention in Andean scholarship in recent decades, but largely in the Peruvian rather than the Bolivian case. Peruvian historian Cecilia Mendez attempts to account for why a clear-cut division had emerged in the 20th century in Peru between coast and sierra, the former imagined as belonging to white mestizos, the latter to Indians. In brief, she argues that the connection between race and geography in Peru, which sees Indian as equivalent to the pejorative term serrano, can be traced back to the 19th century, when the economy shifted from mining in the mountains to exports from the coast. In Bolivian historiography, Brooke Larson identifies the early years of the 20th century as a pivotal moment in the creation of a new political culture, as elites distanced themselves from European racial theories in their attempts to visualize a modern liberal state. Larson suggests elites repudiated a racial policy in the social Darwinist tradition, which dictated that Indians must either disappear or assimilate into the white mestizo population. Instead, the Indian was, in fact, a necessary fixture of the rural landscape, because in the absence of large-scale immigration, production depended on a mass of Indian labor in rural areas and mines. Improving rather than eradicating the Indian rural labor force in the interests of agrarian capitalism was therefore the priority for reformist elites in the early 20th century. The rise of La Paz and the highlands as the hegemonic site of economic power sparked new interest from Bolivian elites in conceptualizing the Andean space. It was in this context that geographic societies were established in Sucre in 1886 and 1889 in La Paz by urban intellectuals. Jaime Mendoza was a Sucre-born ensayista, politician, and medical doctor. His writings were widely disseminated by the Geographic Society of Sucre and epitomize the geograficista tendency in Bolivian intellectual history. That is to say, the idea that geography is central to explaining social reality. For Mendoza, all Bolivian history could be traced to its geographic environment. He writes, "The environment was behind everything. It was behind all those motives that seem to explain human actions." Political theorist Pablo Stefanoni has characterized Mendoza and similar writers as physical nationalists, but it is specifically the Andean space, the Altiplano, not the tropics or valleys, which is the primary basis of Bolivian nationhood. Thus, all Bolivians are children of the Altiplano. Mendoza rescues the Altiplano from marginality and centers it as the basis of a future Bolivian nation. Mendoza argues that this massif gave rise to glorious ancient civilizations such as the Tiwanaku peoples, and therefore could be the basis of civilization in the future, not least because the architectural achievements of Bolivia's pre-Inca civilization is attributed to the propitious effects of the environment. Meanwhile, in La Mentalidad Chola in Bolivia, which was first published in 1928, Daniel Perez Velasco argues that the natural world shapes the psychology of Indians. He notes, "The American race has been, in principle, one which has taken different characteristics according to natural factors, climate, topography, diet, etc., where it has lived. Like Mendoza, he believes the geography of Bolivia impedes national unity. And who would deny it, that these factors, race and geography, are the basis that justifies the natural reason of the nations? Bolivia, in truth, has lacked these two factors." A pervasive idea that developed within the texts I examine here was the notion that the influence of the environment affected some racial groups more than others. Arturo Vilela, a Paceño journalist and diplomat, published a long essay entitled Bolivia Íntima in 1940. He advances the idea that Indians were more susceptible to climatic influences because they lacked civilization. The geographical factor plays a preponderant role in the life of the people. Its influence is decisive, especially in those who have not reached a higher level of culture and civilization, he writes. For Vilela, the inhospitable surroundings of the Andes was an impediment to social progress. The forces and material elements of nature still constitute serious problems that hinder social development. Both the land and people of the Altiplano were timeless, unmoving, and ossified from civilization. In these regions, social life, if it is not primitive, is little evolved. The vast fields of the Altiplano, inhospitable and cold, scarcely offer any production. He observes that the Indian populations did not utilize modern science to extract surpluses from the land. The agricultural regime has not emerged from colonial systems and uses. There is no machinery, and no scientific methods are applied. Composting and watering are expected as miracles from heaven. Here, the construction of landscape as wild and uncultivated is part of a discourse on land productivity, which castigates Indian communities for failing to use their lands productively. The idea that Indians were not using their land productively was ever present in the pre-revolutionary context. An article entitled Bolivia se indigeniza by Rafael Cuenta Tudela in the November 1944 bulletin of the Sucre Geographic Society observed, "There is much talk there of love for the Indian and the need to remove him from the state of semi-savagery in which he vegetates in the fields, dedicated to barbarian myths, alcohol, and a reduced cultivation of his lands, carried out in a primitive way." This was part of a paternalistic discourse which suggested that Indians needed to be rescued from the land in order to civilize. But it also suggests that the land needed to be rescued from Indians if it was to be fruitfully used. Pasto Cabrera Valencia's work, Pensemos en el Indio, was published in 1945, the same year as the first National Indigenous Congress took place amid intensifying demands for land reform from peasant and indigenous communities. In a section entitled Hacia la incorporación del indio a la vida nacional, he theorizes on the role of indigenous peoples in the nation. In contrast with many reformists of the time, Pasto Cabrera Valencia argued that Indians have a sui generis right to the vast, mysterious, and untamed land they lived on by right of their Inca ancestry and tireless labor of centuries. He states, "There is no doubt that land belongs to whoever works it first. The Indian, for this reason, in addition to his ancient Inca heritage, is the only absolute owner of the land." In this, he echoes the rallying cry of the socialist and peasant movements, which were mobilizing to demand agrarian reform at this time. But he deviates from these materialistic arguments to invoke a telluric, mystical relationship between Indians and the landscape as the moral basis for land rights. The Indian grasped the deep sense of the earth better than we do. He is currently the only owner of it, the only one who owns it even by right of love. A common literary and artistic trope in the Andes compared Indians to rocks, with the effect of rendering them immobile, passive, and timeless. Cabrera Valencia reproduces this in his observation that the Indian has a rough and strong soul like the Andean rocks. He lives from time immemorial next to the land, like the withered ivy to the high wall that supports it. More than being shaped by their environment, Indians are presented as features of the landscape in themselves. By this same process, the land itself becomes associated with Indianness. So, to conclude, a reading of these documents shows that a multifaceted discourse connecting the Indian with the natural world and vice versa operated in the first half of the 20th century. The writers examined here all believed that Indians absorbed the qualities of their mountainous environment. But some, such as Mendoza and Cabrera, interpreted this more positively than others. On the one hand, the majesty of the Altiplano could stand as a visual metaphor for the new Bolivian nation, steered by Paceño elites, drawing on this historical legacy of ancient Andean civilizations. But on the other, it was a space inextricably associated with the contemporary Indian, and hence backward, uncivilized, and requiring intervention from authorities. Geography was thus central to a racialized construction of modernity in pre-revolutionary Bolivia. As I discuss in later chapters in my project, this shows that indigenous movements which mobilized for land rights in the early 20th century were confronted with a pre-existing discourse which connected them with the Andean space. This would come to have a decisive impact in shaping approaches to environmental politics by both white mestizo elites and indigenous movements in the later 20th century. Thank you.
Well, should we begin? Inga would like a little bit more time, but I think we should maybe keep moving because we don't want to keep everyone too long, but it'd be great to have time for Q&A. So let's get going with Catalina. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Hello, everyone. Sorry for being the disobedient of this bunch. I couldn't really make a video. But I'm glad to hear the presentations that preceded me because we have a lot of points in common for having a great conversation. So what I'm going to be presenting today is some analysis that came up given my frustration in the UK debate when there's all this hype about the post-colonial and the colonial studies, but oftentimes there's a neglect in understanding the rich history and genealogy of scholars, Latin American scholars, and what they have done in their work to illuminate how we understand the processes of urbanization. And also trying to make a bridge between those discussions and the discussions that have been going around for many decades around Latin American urbanisms. So here I'm proposing the notion of mestizo urbanism and trying to define how the insights from the colonial debate can also inform and contest some of the assumptions and understanding, let's say, from urban studies and urbanism. So first of all, this idea of mestizo has been around and has been long contested, if you will. The idea of mestizo sometimes has been highly criticized for being understood the word itself as a colonized category of hybridity and somehow celebrating its as a liberatory formation. So that's not the acception that I want to take when I'm talking about mestizo urbanism, but rather the idea that Silvia Rivera Kusikansky has been playing with and helping us to understand and contest this notion of mestizo. She's using this idea of mestizo chisi and for understanding the idea of abigarrado and how instead of thinking this hybridity that the mestizo encapsulates, more as an articulation of fragmentations, a juxtaposition of antagonistic identities that don't blend, and that we need to recognize and acknowledge that it has already an internalized domination discourse also in this notion. Of course, when I'm talking about mestizo urbanisms, I refer and I understand that Latin American cities derive precisely from a long historical ongoing intercontinental trajectories of policies, peoples, and capital, and therefore there's this very particular syncretic space. And most of the depictions of Latin American cities, if you see the debates in the agenda of planning, urban studies, is also explaining us how Latin American cities are sites of socio-spatial innovations. And as such, therefore, are a fertile laboratory of innovative space production strategies. So all the literature on urban policy mobility, for instance, take this strand. Therefore, this notion of mestizo urbanism could capture part of this syncretism, but also the territorial palimpsest that is embedded in the urban fabric of Latin American cities, as well as the understanding of the geopolitics of urban knowledges that have been shaping our Latin American cities, but also challenging some of the colonial assumptions. And therefore, I argue that the reason the colonial effervescence in urban studies is still disjointed, preventing a renewed emancipatory understanding of the spatiality of Latin American cities. Therefore, when I'm thinking about this, what is at the core of the colonial approach, we have this connection, or this, in a way, three concurrent spheres in terms of the coloniality of power, the coloniality of being, and the coloniality of knowledge. But I wonder how we can understand this for explaining how the urbanization process is taking place, and how can we think differently our cities as sites of emancipation. It's clear then now in the colonial debate that the colonization is about changing the way we think, that is a process, not a product, that in every design, and I'm coming from urban design, I'm an urbanist and an architect, so therefore I'm perhaps a little bit alien with the crowd that we've been sharing this afternoon. So for me, design and how we think, how to transform and rethink and rehearse, if you will, a collective imagination of how we change our cities is essential. And therefore, I'm trying to figure out how to connect the discussion and the debates of the colonial thinking in the more applied field of planning and urban design. But is this a struggle with the authority of the canon, that the one that has undermined the work in a way produced by the non-Western cultures and the people that come from poorer backgrounds? And that's the bias that is inherited in the urbanism as discipline itself. And of course, we cannot, I have to run. We cannot overlook the powerful pre-Hispanic urbanisms that are there and oftentimes are not even taught in schools of urbanism. What can we learn from these ways of shaping space and understanding our relation with nature, with conviviality, and other ways of understanding the transformation of space? It's clear to us then that the grid became a possession mark, a sign of the creation of the new world. And this is pretty much the blueprint of many of the Latin American cities. And of course, we have still the legacy of the struggles to shape independentism and Republican identities that is embedded in the different typologies we inherit in our cities. But it's also clear that urbanism studies were introduced by European scholars, and they have given us the whole imprint and structure, even nowadays, how we think, how the norms and the legislations are made, and how schools and the curricula is defined. Therefore, we cannot even understand now the modern movement, for instance, if we don't understand how Latin American cities were the testing ground of the ideas of the very Le Corbusier, for instance. But also it challenges to think these very simple dichotomies of the direction of influence in terms of the innovative practices, and also the exchanges between South and South and South and North. Take, for instance, the idea of the participatory budgeting that emanated from Brazil and Porto Alegre, and now is one of the most celebrated and, let's say, copied practice across the world. Of course, in this entanglement and the military urbanisms, we also have to think and challenge what are still the very colonial practices that shape our urban space. And therefore, these elements help us to think what are the key urbanization processes in Latin American cities, and to what extent the very long-term thought of Latin American scholars that have been discussing the colonial issues can help us to illuminate these issues. So I'm gonna just go super quickly, because I guess I have 3 minutes and 20 slides more. One is the idea of downtown public space and the disputes for the transformation and the reshaping of public spaces, and the contested facts that are done by these imposed designs, for instance, the Corredor of Chapultepec in Mexico or the Bicentenario Park in Bogota. Or this transformation of brutal renewal of downtown spaces here portrayed also in the case of Bogota, and how many economic circuits and relocation are still being portrayed or used as the key strategy for transforming cities. Or what do the colonial scholars have to say, or what can we learn to rethink these practices of pro-entrepreneurial urbanism, where mega events and mega projects are the first part of the repertoire of our city's transformation. And here the case of the Olympic City is one of them. Or how this pro-entrepreneurial urbanism manifests itself in these gated communities and these places that have been defining and shaping the landscapes of our cities. How the land value capture then is interpreted there, and is there a way to think decolonially about this possession that is taking place? But also, what could be the colonial lens in terms of understanding our peripheral marginality, and how self-built settlements, self-management of these cities can be illuminated? Can we think then differently through the colonial lens, this peripheral marginality, these precarious livelihoods, and these spaces of also a different type of dispossession that the state has been providing through this massive scale in these housing projects? And how can we think from this decolonial perspective on the territorial scale of infrastructures? And how can we then, and I'm not gonna then finish and I'll go through, because if I have a minute, I can't. These discussions that we've been having in terms of the cultural studies and the epistemological disobedience to think from anew these conditions of the transformation of Latin American cities. How can geography help us to shape that? But even more so, how can we think differently also the production of knowledge that has been long rooted in the practices that, for instance, Orlando Falsborda has been given us long ago, or the very Freire with education studies, and how this can be understood and put in practice to understand how cities are played out. But most importantly, how the colonial aesthetics can also help us to think differently. What are the type of cities that we need to be shaping as a spaces of liberation? And I think we have to live with this idea that we have mestizo cities, and that somehow we are always embedded in this tension, in never blending, but also having and containing the contradiction of these different identities. Therefore, just to conclude, I think this notion of mestizo urbanisms helping us to think about the configuration of the geopolitical formation of our cities as a historical and ongoing intercontinental trajectories, that we are part of these multiple directions of influence that are syncretic spaces of hybridity, and that therefore are also need to be thought as sites of socio-spatial innovation. And therefore we still are in depth of how can these traditions of urbanism and the colonial thinking can be nurturing each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation to end on. Thank you. So we've already got some really fascinating questions. So let's jump straight into those if that's okay. I imagine most people can see them, but Peter had a question for Blanca on tell us this distinction between the horizontal and vertical social relations. Does this help to think through the social relations at the beach? And for Olivia, did the thinking of the period envisage a change in environment could lead to a change in human beings? Perhaps you two could take those in that order, Blanca and then Olivia. You're muted.
Thank you. No, just before I start, I just wanted to thank you and Nadia for having me participate in this symposium and presenting my master's research. It really shows like an attempt to sort of deconstruct the power hierarchies in academia and promote the circulation of knowledge. So thank you for that. And just to get on to Peter's question, thank you for that. I'm glad you brought up teles because I actually use them a lot in my research. And very much so, I think the idea of horizontal and vertical social relations can be applied to Ipanema Beach and the interactions and their dynamics that happen within this space. And it really shows the duality of both conviviality and a sense of democraticness in that sense that everyone can talk to one another, but of course the hierarchies that pertain to the wider urban order of Rio still exist. So that very much is at play. And in terms of relating it to beach economic informality, I do also borrow a lot from Teles about how they talk about the heterogeneity in uses and benefits of informality, and talking about how complex it is and how it really cannot be generalized because it's so different from everyone. And just to draw another connection from this point that I actually would love to take into research in the future is to draw a parallel between the horizontality and verticality that can be seen on the beach space with the topography around the beach space, because you have both horizontality and verticality, and then surrounding it you have two very major favelas, so vertical informal living, and you also have the line of very elite high rises looking at the beach space. So you see that this verticality and horizontality, both sort of metaphorically and physically through the Rio's topography, is constantly at play on the beach space.
You're muted, Archie.
I was just going to pass straight across to Olivia. Thanks, Blanca.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Peter, for the question. Yeah, I absolutely think it was felt that they could change, that Indigenous peoples could change through development. I think it was a discourse about redeeming the Indian, about making them fit for the nation. It was not about eradication, strictly speaking. And I suppose in this sense, it reflects, in common with other Latin American states this time, the traction that Lamarckian ideas around, Lamarckian eugenicist ideas around the role of environmental factors in genetic inheritance, environmental change, including the physical environment, which could result in an improved genetic stock. I think in Bolivia, this would culminate in some senses in agrarian reform, or you can see this sort of as a continuation in some ways of this idea, agrarian reform in '53 after the revolution, which resulted in obviously the dissolution of haciendas in the highlands to be replaced by a more sort of, well, eventually the kind of more parcelization of lands, the individualization of land ownership. But in terms of the elite perspectives behind agrarian reform, I think it was an impulse around the transformation of indigenous peoples into non-indigenous campesinos, imposing agrarian capitalism in the countryside for elites could result in I think there's a quote, I remember, I think the liquidation of the indigenous as indigenous. So in this sense, the social and economic transformation in the countryside could be understood as a racial project. But I think absolutely it was a discourse on development. It wasn't, it didn't posit that there could be no development in the first place.
Thank you both. There's a question just coming from Angela on, she writes for Blanca, but I'm not sure if she's drawing on the connection between Blanca and Catalina's work, but maybe you could both reflect on her question. Could you talk more about how the concept of mestizo cities might relate to actually existing racism or racial democracy? And she refers specifically to Brazil, but maybe in the kind of social structure of cities across Latin America as well. How does, I guess it's difficult to ask you, Blanca, to immediately apply Catalina's conceptual framework, but go for it.
I think Catalina is much better suited to answer this question than I am, so I'm not going to let you have it.
but I think there's a previous question to that that Manuel sent. But I can go and try to think about it. So I think something that I've been still trying to connect is this whole notion about racial capitalism, and how racial capitalism then is kind of the grounds of how the financial accumulation that is allowed by the fabric of cities actually is deployed and performed. And therefore, I feel that there's still a connection that I need to to draw and link that to the notion of mestizo urbanisms, because what I've been doing is more trying to think in this linkage between how the production of a space and the knowledge of urban space, and how is the depiction by urban scholars about a space. And it's very long overdue, the connection between race and space, particularly in the debates of planning and urbanism. And by the way, I'm going to share a link here, and I'm going to do marketing. We put together a curricula that is open and you can download in the Bartlett at UCL, precisely because we felt the need that there was not a single module that talks about this connection. And I think it's so essential that we are just starting to try to make this connection. So perhaps it's useful for you to share.
Absolutely, please. We'll circulate it to all attendees. In fact, that's just a moment to say, if anybody else has other work that they think attendees would be interested, please send them to us, and we'll send it to everyone who registered today afterwards. Unless, Blanca, you wanted to add anything on that, then please do.
I would just add, if I could apply that idea sort of to the spatial context of Ipanema Beach, is that I put in a lot of effort to try to conceptualize this space according to the people that sort of produce that space. And I think in doing that, I really try to sort of give a different approach to the beach economic informality, and arguing that even though they are the people that are treating in very precarious conditions, and that there's a lot of, they suffer from the racial democracy of Brazil, they're actually very responsible in creating the space of Ipanema Beach, and in sort of determining its movement. And I think doing that gives them the agency that they deserve, and the responsibility that they have in creating this urban public space, and gives them the sort of the visibility that they're really responsible for. Because if I give you an example, they are the first people to arrive at the beach and the last people to arrive at the beach, and they are responsible for making the rules of how things work, and they have a network across this huge beach space. And so I think it's part of what Catalina has said about looking to a place according to its own terms.
Thank you. I just thought I might just see if Jefferson wanted to come in, because he had a question earlier for you, Blanca, in relation to this, but I think it relates as well. And if there was anything that wasn't covered in relation to kind of the question of the possibility of democratic coexistence in the context of Rio. Did you want to add anything further, Jefferson?
No, I was just like asking more like how, what is like the rules with like the differences participating, because just for me, even still like there is a lot of like agents on the informal jobs. I was just like, how to be accountable for the different places that people are there. Like, I mean, like when Black bodies are there as visitors, or they are like vigilated by the police, and when they are there as workers, that I would say as a way that we can read them as someone subservient, then they are welcome. So like my question is like to think a little bit more if the difference, the inhabiting of the difference in the same place means horizontality.
I missed part of that question, unfortunately. I'm mainly gonna like grow from the comment that you left. So yeah, I mean, I am talking a lot about this space of democratic coexistence, and I am acknowledging entirely lack of the beach being a democratic public space. And it is absolutely true that informal workers are in a vulnerable condition in where like the military police is constantly surveilling them and controlling them. But thinking beyond that, and I sort of already mentioned this in my previous answer, there is such a strong network of solidarity, not just from beach worker to beach worker, but also from beachgoer to beach worker, in which there is an acknowledgement of the racist structures that take place on this space, and there is a push for helping one another to stop not stop the policing, because that's not possible, but to try to remediate it or alleviate it in some sort of way. And also, it is the beach space, I think, is special because it invites you to not only think about the poor Black person as the one that's working or providing a service, but they're also at the same time a person that's there for leisure. So there's that duality all the time, that they are using that space for different purposes, and that really makes a difference in how they're entertaining with that space, and how sort of the wider urban order of Rio affects them. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question, Jefferson?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sure there's more dimensions of that which could be picked up. But I wanted to just bring in, and just to say, we've in theory only got 5 minutes left, but I was going to carry on until maybe 6:40 UK time. But of course, if people need to go, then that's the way it is. But Olivia, I just wanted to pick up a couple of the questions that have come in for you in relation to, there's a question from Jonathan saying, given that geography was central to elite constructions of modernity in early 20th century Bolivia, how did Bolivian writers comment on the loss of the sea in the construction of Bolivian national consciousness? And I think there was a kind of related question as well, not that closely related, but there is another question about the same sort of body of work from Michaela about whether there are kind of references to North American anthropologists, and what is the kind of literary referencing world of the texts that you discuss.
Yeah, it's really great to have a question from Michaela. I draw on a lot of her work in the Argentine case. This paper I drew quite heavily from her work. The truth is, I don't have a lot of information about the authors that I'm writing on, which is something that is in some ways a problem. Jaime Mendoza is quite well known, and there is information on him. And actually, I don't know off the top of my head, but his work, Macizo Boliviano, is heavily drawn from the work of a Spanish geographer, I believe. I can double check that. But in terms of the influence of North American anthropologists, this I'm less sure of. And a lot of the texts that I look at are quite sort of isolated in some ways. I mean, the authors, I find it very difficult to find any biographical information about them. The texts are drawn largely from the bulletins from the Geographic Society of Sucre and La Paz, as well as from the British Library. But yeah, it's definitely something that I'm aware of. I certainly don't think there are references to North American anthropologists, but that is something I would like to think about more. Yeah, the question about the loss of the sea. I think definitely in Jaime Mendoza's work, you see elements of that in the sense that it's this sort of how to create, it's the construction of modernity, the construction of a nation state when coming out of, the loss of, huge amounts of land. I think it does propel a sense of national, a need to reimagine or to rethink the nation state. Certainly in Jaime Mendoza's work. And then Peter's question, which was about, I can't find it here, but I think you see the sort of reification of, or whether environmental explanations are actually just a kind of cover in some ways for what is a biological determinism. I think you definitely see that in the Peruvian case, although I don't work so much on that, but I have drawn a lot on the historiography for this paper for that. in the sense that when, obviously the emergence of Serrano as a highly pejorative term comes in a context in which it's no longer safe to talk about Indians, that Serrano has to be a kind of cover for that. And in that sense, you see what is in an environmental term, but is actually strictly speaking, it's racialized. It's biological. So but I don't think you see that so much in the Bolivian case. But that is something I'll think about, and it's a really thought-provoking question. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Catalina, I thought you were right. I missed Manuel's question earlier on. Sorry about that. So did you want to come back to that? He asked whether you could talk a little bit more about the colonial monuments in the Americas that highlight the achievement of colonize as well and visibilize the role of indigenous peoples in the shaping of nations. And I guess he's also picking up on some of the really interesting images that you juxtaposed in your presentation.
Yeah, I think now, I'm from Colombia, and I'm coming from a city that is deeply Catholic and has in the very center like the image and the monument of colonial figures, let's say. But I think there's all this independentist idea and creating republics is very embedded in how public spaces are shaped. I haven't done research particularly on monuments, but I think that unlike some other places like, South Africa or even in the US, there are these figures and there's a lot of debate about the symbolic weight they have. I haven't heard that much these discussions around these monuments. However, when you see the social unrest that was happening just right before the pandemic hit us, you could see that in many of the images, for instance, from Chile and the central monument that is in what has been called La Plaza de la Dignidad, you can see that is the Mapuche flag that is covering kind of the central monument there. And when you see, for instance, a lot of the marches that were going on, and somehow there's this phenomenon of wrapping up some of these monuments with the flag from the Andes, from the Indigenous, from the Andes. So I think there's some icons that are being reclaimed as part of the social unrest, but I haven't found yet that there's big contestations around these monuments so far. I think we have so many big other problems to focus on, to be honest, that I think hasn't gained any political traction so far.
There was just one more question which is outstanding. So we'll come to, I think, I may be wrong, but for Olivia. So we'll take that. And then I was thinking, I don't know what you think, Nadia, but maybe just to start kind of wrapping up, I might ask if all of the presenters from the day want to add anything, to have any responses to some of the conversation. Just very quickly, kind of a couple of minutes or something. If people wanted to say anything, that would be really nice. So just while you all think about that, there's a question from Matthias, Olivia, asking whether the environmental determinist vision still plays a role in state discourses, and how could you kind of give an example of environmental policies perhaps guided by this vision?
Okay, so contemporary environmental policies guided by environmental determinism. Okay, this does go beyond the scope of my research, but I suppose you could definitely start to sort of think about it in relation to lowland indigenous mobilization in Bolivia in terms of the tipness. And one of the starting points for my own research was in kind of contemporary discourse, how we've seen these very essentialistic ideas about indigenous people being guardians of the rainforest, inextricably connected to the natural world, to the environment, in ways that non-indigenous people are not. And so that was one of the starting points for my research. How can we, how are the ways in which indigenous people are related with the natural world historically contingent? How have they changed over time? but so in that sense, I think there is definitely probably sort of vestiges of environmental determinism in the way Indigenous people, particularly I think in lowland areas in Bolivia, are presented. That's.
Thank you. That's great. I think
it's time for the participants to probably give some feedback to each other if they wanted to, if they have any questions about each other's paper. That'll be really nice to wrap up in a nice way before we leave at 6:40.
Great. So should we go around from the beginning and see from the beginning of the day or the afternoon, and see if people would like to it can be anything. So who was first? Jefferson? Yeah.
It was Jefferson and Enrique. I mean, if Jefferson and Enrique want to share anything about each other's research in Brazil, that would be amazing, because we saw how both Afro-descendant populations and indigenous populations are facing particularly forms of violence and racialization in different ways that are particularly exclusive through the historical production of the identities of these groups. So do you want Jefferson and Enrique add to each other?
If I can, I think what the research of Enrique and mine, they put together is how the death and the terror is really central in the making of the Brazilian state. How the killing and violence is a primary tool in making the state, and how it attach some kind of bodies that's making out of a difference. It can be Black, it can be Indigenous, it can be how the way of Brazil doing national is violating these internal waters. I think I think it's interesting that we are together here in this panel, actually, because the urban and the indigenous studies, they are normally separated. Now we have different groups studying indigenous people, and then you have people studying but actually this logic is they are really, for me, more and more I would like to see works that can cross these different fields because of the similarities. For example, you can see in these two works right now, and in the discourses that are target for these different populations.
Excellent. Enrique, do you want to add something?
Hello. Well, I'm muting. I think that's what Jefferson said is very interesting about we have some things in common, like this genocidal and ethnocidal, epistemicidal processes in Brazil affecting Black people, Indigenous people, and the whole population in a general sense. So this idea of crossing rural, urban, and different aspects of this oppression to Brazilian people in general is really interesting. I'm really glad I could participate in this webinar. All the discussions were so excellent. I'll email some of you because I have some questions and some things I'd like to ask further, but we don't have much time here. So thank you very much, everyone. And it was great, really great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Jefferson and Enrique, for panel one and such an insightful and amazing discussions on race in Brazil. And now I'm going to move on to Anna, because Martina had to work and she had to retire. But Anna, would you like to comment to make any comment about Martina? And also we also see how your research kind of both spoke to each other in the ways that you take different approaches to care, even though that Martina's research is based in Europe, yours is based in the Caribbean. So it was kind of reclaiming this feminist poetics around how do we mobilize together in different spaces, whether it's in the physical world or whether it's in the virtual world. Did you want to add something else?
Yeah, what I found particularly interesting is the focus we both had on collectivities. So it's common in activism, of course, but especially in feminist activism, it's really important to create a collectivity, to have people to share your not only your activism with, but your problems, someone who will listen to you and be there for you and believe you, which is what a popular hashtag, Yo sí te creo, in Spain, in Latin America. And I think that's the essence of feminist activism. It's just believing each other and helping each other out.
Exactly, great introduction about the intersection of feminism in Latin America, or involving Latin American women. Now I'm just going to hand it to you, Archie. And thank you so much again, Anna, for your research, and Martina, yes, probably I'll email her. But yeah, now we can move on to panel 3.
Wonderful. Manuel and then Carrie, did you have any final kind of reflections?
Okay, shall I go first? Or,
yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much again for this invitation, and I think it's wonderful to have these different approaches from different disciplines, and it was wonderful. I mean, I see a connection with my own research with all of the participants, and I cannot comment all of them, but in particular with Catalina, of course, with Kari. I didn't mention in my presentation, but 2 years ago, I was involved in a project in Yucatan regarding a similar situation with the destruction of the environmental destruction by industrial cultivation, especially for soybeans, and as well as affecting sacred places of the Maya, and destroying them and so on. So a lot of connections there, and as well as the research of Blanca, and you may know Cancun. And Cancun is a similar place as Ipanema, where you have many people there, and there is also a movement of Maya peoples that cannot access to particular beaches there because they are kind of privatized by the main hotels and so on. So there are many dimensions of how we can connect each other, as well as Enrique, Olivia as well. I really like the theoretical profound discussion you had. And of course, in 20 minutes, we don't have much time to go into, but I'm really happy to have this discussion with all of you guys, and I would also love to keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And now, Kari?
Yes, I've really enjoyed this encounter, and I think with Manuel's work, these different ways that he reveals that there's this manufacturing of consent was really productive for me to think with when talking about the different ways that people are engaged with these state processes that establish the rules from the get-go. And then if they don't necessarily fit the rules, well then again, they'll shift the goalposts, change the border demarcations, and reinvent some of the different rules. So helping me to have another example of these hegemonic processes, and how the project of the Mayan Tren Maya is also taking up property and redefining some different kinds of points along the way, I think is really interesting to think about, like the linear intervention of the train connecting these different monuments that also creates this different kind of territoriality. So I really enjoyed dialoguing, and as well, I think I echo in saying that with Enrique and I believe Jefferson, yes, thank you. That those particular ways of thinking about racialization and the perhaps production of what Linda Green calls nobodies or disposable people, thinking about Zygmunt Bauman, is this process of racialization, and also the idea of, you know, who you can push off, who can you push away, who you can eliminate. So thank you very much. It's been really great, and I hope to keep in contact.
Thank you so much, Carrie and Manuel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blanca, and then Olivia, and finally Catalina. If you all just have any final thoughts, that'd be wonderful.
So I think just to like encompass all of the wonderful presentations that we've seen today, I would like to touch on, I think, the responsibility that we have as members of academia and people that have produced academic research, and sort of going beyond critically engaging with notions of race and class in space and in theory and practice, and sort of trying to do something good with whatever findings and whatever research we produce. I think we've reached a point where it's not enough to simply denounce racism or denounce precarity, but try to find within our research potential solutions, potential lessons from within that reflect possibility and value in order to actually attempt to move forward. So, and that was definitely visible in a lot of presentations and comments. And I just think it's a very valuable thing to keep in mind as we keep going and carrying out research.
Yeah, and just quickly, thanks to Archie and Nadia. It was really great. I suppose just for me, I really enjoyed, or I found very useful. I think it was Carrie's paper, that the question from Peter about the relationship between campesino, indigena, and I really liked Carrie's response about that being a sort of a relationship of labour and livelihood that is mediated through these different relationships to the land, and you know, there's no such thing as a completely campesino community and so on. And so that for me, I took away as very helpful. And also just thanks to everybody for really wonderful presentations.
Well, I cannot think much more timely moment of discussing race, space, and activism than today, that everyone in the social media and in the streets of Minnesota are protesting against police brutality in the US. And at the same time, when you see The Guardian reports about BME minorities in the UK being disproportionately affected by COVID, I think now we really need to create a new post-pandemic imagination of what is the new normal. We can no longer accept this racialized work. And white privilege is being rampant, particularly here. And the fact that today the UK is the country with the highest mortality rate in the world is a shame. And I think is deeply embedded both in the imperial mindset of how we still operate, but also in a deeply embedded racist society that unfortunately keeps thriving and it keeps electing the wrong people to lead us.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Catalina. Thank you so much, Blanca. Thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you. I definitely don't have anything to add to that from Catalina, and that sounds, I mean, yes. Yeah. Maybe we can take this forward, at least in academia, and do something useful future work as well, because we'd really hope this is the beginning of ongoing work and staying in touch with you all, and hopefully with all the attendees as well who've been here through the day. And thank you all to all of the attendees as well, because it's a strange system where you can't speak and you just have to kind of listen to the people on the screen. But thank you for bearing with that. And also thank you to attendees and to participants for speaking in English, which I think is a kind of just unacknowledged, but is a problem in itself. But that's the nature of contemporary academia to some extent. I don't have anything else to add other than that we will hope to stay in touch with everybody and see what comes out of it, and would love to hear any ideas that people have for what might come out of it. Nadia, did you want to say anything to finish?
No, I think we pretty much you guys have pretty much covered up all the topics that we could actually discuss in this afternoon. It was an excellent and productive event. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. And again, we will find ways to move this conversation forward in the near future. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to the participants as well. Thank you.